try that again. Just checking to make sure my voice, oh, here we go. I sound a lot more audible now. Everybody can hear me at the back? We're all good? Okay, fantastic. Thanks for the AV folks here to help us tonight. As we start this meeting, as we do all of our meetings, by just acknowledging that we're gathering on the traditional territories of the Coast and Straits Salish peoples. And specifically, we acknowledge the Lekwungen people known today as the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations, and that their historic connections to these lands and the adjoining waters continues to this day. We have our first order of business is just approval of the agenda, but as we just want to add one piece of this, that the special committee of the whole be approved, which includes public participation. So I can have that moved and seconded. Thank you. Any discussion on the agenda? Seeing none, all those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. That carries. I'm Mayor Kevin Murdoch. It's my distinct honor to be a mayor of Oak Bay. I have a few brief remarks, as I typically do at the beginning of a meeting, but these ones are specific to this agenda item. There's been 3 public meetings, and we'll get to that to help inform the public already on these provincially mandated changes and potential approaches to these changes. So the full public input is not available tonight in our agenda. We were hoping to have that, but there was just our last session was held just 48 hours ago, so we don't have all of that. But that will be, if you submitted information through that process, it will be coming to us in a cohesive package, coming back at our next council meeting. Tonight we're sitting as committee of the whole, and for those of you who aren't local government nerds, that just basically means that we are sitting here as an informal body. We can't make decisions. We're not a legislative body tonight. We are just meeting as we can't make decisions. We're not a legislative body tonight. We are just meeting as a committee, but it's a committee of all of council. So we will make recommendations tonight back to council, and those will help inform staff's report and bylaws coming back to council. Yes, procedurally, we just have a single item agenda, but obviously there's a lot of information to get through. So let's just get straight to that item. So item 4 on the agenda is our special meeting matters, housing in Oak Bay, and we have Mr. Boel, our Director of Community Building and Planning. I'm just going to lay out briefly the order of business here and expectations. We set up a lot of space in here for lots of people. We don't have quite as many as we thought we might have, but there's still lots of people here. So what's going to happen now is the staff are going to walk through the presentation. We'll then allow the members of the committee of the whole, members of council, to ask clarifying questions of staff. I'm going to ask that we all ask those concisely and ask staff to answer those as concisely as possible. And then following that, we'll invite members of the public. You're welcome to come forward and ask questions or make comments. Both are welcome. If you have any issue with mobility and can't stand, we will have a roving microphone as well as the microphone at the front here. And I'll give you the procedure when we get to that. Obviously, this is a complicated issue. Our primary driver here, there's many things in this that we don't have control over. They're legislated by the province, but there are quite a few things that we do have some potential control over. And we just really want to hear tonight from you to understand, are we missing anything? Are there aspects of this that have unintended consequences? Are we missing opportunities that might exist? And so that's kind of the flavor tonight, that we're trying to make sure that we're in this very concentrated amount of public input, that we have those pieces. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to our Director of Community Building and Planning, Mr. Boel, and he will walk through a presentation, not a brief presentation, but reasonably brief presentation, that will go through what's been mandated, what's on the table for us, and some options. So with that, welcome, Mr. Boel.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll run through the presentation. It should come up in a moment on the screen. I'm joined by my colleagues, Brian Green, Deputy Director of Community Building and Planning, and Carly Ramel, Senior Planner. And online we have our lead consultant, Jeanette Elmore, as well, from Modus. What we'll cover today in the presentation is quite a bit of content, a little bit of looking back at how we got here, explaining what kind of things we are discussing today, and also, of course, in detail, what kind of zoning bylaw changes we are looking at implementing in the coming months, and closing off with next steps for the future, the near future, but also further out. Starting with the background, housing has increasingly been on the top of mind for a number of years now. And one of the things I wanted to provide here is referring back to the Housing Needs Report from 2020, where it was clearly stated that our community does need additional housing units. We also need additional rental units, and we need additional affordable housing units in the coming years to accommodate our community's housing needs. Infill housing that we're discussing today is part of that solution. It's not all of it, but it does deal with the ground-oriented or single-family style housing forms. The infill housing strategy was worked on in 2022 and endorsed by Council that year, and some of the people here might be familiar with that. And it was an extensive process with a lot of community engagement to talk about what kind of options of additional housing is the community interested in, and there was technical analysis done as well. The process concluded with a survey, and we had promoted that to all households in Oak Bay. We received over 1,600 responses to that survey, and that has been very helpful for the work today that includes some of those insights. And one of the things that was acknowledged already at the time of the infill housing strategy is that some of these new housing types may not be able to be accommodated under the existing regulations of the district, and that we would need to make changes. Three important guiding principles that were formulated for the infill housing strategy are the ones on the screen. Number one on the left-hand side is provide diverse housing options. And that speaks to creating new options beyond single family and the existing apartment and condominiums that are available. The middle one, guiding principle number 2, is supporting the ease of implementation, and that's referring to creating new rules and regulations and processes that are easy to navigate. That was one of the things that came out of the infill housing strategy, an interest to be able to access these new housing types in a convenient way, so to say. The third principle is cherish what the community loves, and that speaks to the existing qualities in the district, the tree cover, the style of housing, the streetscapes, everything that makes Oak Bay. And that's another important guiding principle to formulate a program that retains and builds on those qualities. Since then, since the endorsement of the strategy in 2022, a lot has happened in 2023 at the provincial level. A lot of announcements were made initially. The first half of 2023, BC Homes for People plan was launched. In the spring of 2023, Oak Bay was one of 10 communities selected for a housing target order. And then in the fall, more specifics became available. That meant for us that we paused the next steps for the infill housing program. We wanted to make sure that we're not doing work that would be later perhaps unnecessary or in conflict with new legislation. So once we got the details last fall and over the winter, we were able to move forward. This resulted in the creation of a housing action program. And this housing action program builds on the infill housing initiative that we had earlier, but expands it and accelerates things as well. And there's a number of planned initiatives as part of that program. And today we're talking specifically about infill housing, our ground-oriented housing form. But multi-unit housing and mixed-use options are also going to be coming up pretty soon. And we intend to make that part of a required update to the official community plan. And that is planned to start later this year, and it is required by the province to be completed by the end of next year. And in addition to that, we also have other housing initiatives, but they are not confirmed just yet, but tentatively penciled in for the years after that. This slide, it's a bit hard to read. This outlines those different projects. And it's a bit hard to read, but there's one other project that I want to highlight because Council had to make some choices last year on budget and priorities for community planning, and housing, of course, became our top priority, was already one of our main priorities. The infill housing changes and changes related to infill for OCP were two projects that were prioritized. And the third one I want to highlight is called amenity cost charges and development cost charges programs. And those, that's another important project where we get to review our infrastructure, the capacity to absorb growth. It also extends to community amenities. And we intend to make use of new tools that become available, have become available through the provincial changes. And one is called an amenity cost charges mechanism, and the other one already existed, but development cost charges, we don't have that yet, but those two programs we intend to, we are accelerating or prioritizing to develop as well. And they will be discussed later this summer and become available later this year. Then moving over to the provincial housing legislation, that's where I will hand it over to Brian Green. Thank you.
Thanks, Andre. Good evening, Your Worship, members of Council and members of the public. I'm going to give a brief overview of some of the recent changes to housing legislation that the provincial government has recently introduced. And so, yeah, in 2023, the province brought sweeping changes through the Housing Supply Act, as well as changes to the Local Government Act that had the aim of increasing housing supply, as well as trying to build housing faster. As a result of this legislation that the province has introduced, the district is required to review and update its land use planning framework over both in the short term as well as over the next couple of years as well. So the first piece of legislation that the province introduced in 2023 was the Housing Supply Act. This legislation enables the province to set housing target orders for municipalities. And so under Bill 43, in September of last year, the district of Oak Bay was one of 10 municipalities that received a housing target order. The district's housing target order requires that the district meet 664 net new dwelling units within the next 5 years. That's by September 2028. On Monday, April 22nd, Council received from staff an interim Period 1 report setting out how the district was performing in relation to the first 6 months of Period 1 that ran from October the 1st to March 2024, and a copy of that reporting form and the report that we submitted to the province can be found on the district's housing webpage, and the district is required by the legislation to publish that reporting form on its website. And so the district is working towards its target. Obviously, the Infill housing programme is a key component, is a key part of trying to meet that housing target. But also achieving this housing target will also involve and include developer interest. Obviously, we're aware of high interest rates, but also other factors such as staffing and the need to streamline processes will all help to ensure that we try and meet that target. Obviously, it's also interesting to note that the housing target order is based on occupancy permits rather than permits issued, and so there is generally a lag between sort of rezoning applications, development permits, subdivision, building permits being issued, and actually units actually being occupied, which is when the occupancy permit is given. And generally there's 3 or 4 years generally between those processes to get to an occupancy permit. So the next piece of legislation that the province introduced last year was Bill 46, which was Development Financing Act. Under Bill 46, the district is able to use development financing tools to support new infrastructure and amenities. And so the first of which is development cost charges. And so development cost charges have been around for a number of years, but currently doesn't exist in Oak Bay. And so through that process, the district is able to introduce a development cost charge bylaw that will allow to receive essentially at building permit stage or subdivision stage the ability to require a certain amount of charges to be provided to the district, which would be then used to fund much needed infrastructure, mainly roads, sewer, water, storm, parkland acquisition, but more recently that legislation was amended to also include solid waste facilities and emergency services buildings. A new financing tool that the province introduced and has created is what's called an amenity cost charge, and so that is identified, or that's been introduced to allow districts to require or obtain funding from developments to fund other types of facilities such as community facilities, libraries, recreation centres, those types of more softer infrastructure can now be funded through that amenity cost charge programme. And so through the implementation of the Housing Action Programme, the district is prioritising those programmes, and we hope to have a bylaw, a development cost charge bylaw in place later this year, as well as an amenity cost charge programme. And so we do have a consultant now appointed who is now reviewing those rates, and will be coming back to council later this year with those two programmes. So today we're mainly going to be talking about Bill 44 and the Residential Development Amendment Act. This requires municipalities to allow 3 to 4 units of small-scale multi-unit housing that must be permitted on each parcel of land if zoned exclusively for single-family or duplex residential. And there is a requirement by the province that each municipality must have updated its zoning bylaw to allow that additional density and housing types by June the 30th of this year. So while the legislation establishes the framework for the new rules, the details describing how these changes work on the ground are laid out in a provincial policy manual. And so in preparing or amending or adopting a zoning bylaw to permit the use and density required by the SMU legislation, a local government must also consider any applicable guidelines for small-scale multi-unit housing when reviewing its zoning bylaw, and that's included within this policy manual. Oh, there was a slide missing there, but I'm not sure where that's gone. Let's go back. Just wanted also to mention on this Act, this requires also local governments to update their official community plans by December 31st, 2025, and also a requirement for a housing needs assessment that must be completed by December the 31st of this year. And the two, probably one of the biggest changes to those official community plans and housing needs assessments that now must be completed is that those must look at the housing needs of a community over a 20-year period. So in relation to small-scale multi-unit housing, what is it and what does it include? So essentially, SMU, small-scale multi-unit housing, is ground-oriented housing that is to be built at a similar scale, which fits within existing low-density single-family residential neighbourhoods. It includes housing forms such as duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, garden suites, secondary suites, and townhouses. And so through the district's infill housing strategy work, we heard from the community that there was support for encouraging a range of infill housing types and overall support for these types of housing. What is new with the provincial SMU legislation is that the province has set the densities for SMU that we must accommodate and achieve in our zoning bylaws by June the 30th this year. So specifically, the province requires on lots currently restricted to single detached homes or duplexes, the district must permit up to 3 units on lots less than 280 square metres, or just over 3,000 square feet, 4 units on lots greater than 280 square metres and less than 4,050 square metres, and those are between 3,000 square feet and 43,000 square feet, and then 2 or 3 units with or without an accessory dwelling unit on heritage designated properties, and those are where they are designated by bylaw. And in terms of also lots that are greater than the 4,050 square metres or just over 43,000 square feet, that number of units also applies, the 2 or 3 units also applies to those very big lots. And so, as I mentioned earlier, here's the slide I was thinking that was next that has now appeared, is in addition to the district amending its zoning bylaw in relation to those prescribed densities, the district must also consider some other site standards, and those site standards are contained within a provincial policy manual. And so, whilst these don't form actually part of the legislation and we're not required to amend our zoning bylaw to align with those guidelines that the province has introduced, the district must consider those site standards to enable infill housing. And so those guidelines that the province has issued, the province essentially issued guidelines in relation to parking, heights, setbacks, lot coverage, as well as floor area ratio, to name a few siting regulations, and we must consider those and determine whether the district is going to essentially apply the provincial guidelines or adopt its own guidelines. But we must also then set out a reason when the bylaws are presented to council as to why we are essentially not applying the provincial guidelines and why we decided to take a slightly different approach. And so just in terms of the zoning bylaw, what is it? You know, a zoning bylaw is essentially a council bylaw that regulates how land, buildings and other structures may be used. It regulates the siting, the form, the massing of development through regulations that control height, setbacks, lot coverage and density. So so here's just a little bit of a slide to showing what some of those regulations are. We have height of a building, which is the maximum allowable height. In the case of Oak Bay, we have actually 3 definitions of height. We have occupiable height, we have building height, and then we also have roof height. We also have setbacks in relation to front yards, rear yards, as well as side yards, as well as combined setbacks. And then we also have parking standards as well that in the case of the District of Oak Bay, they're actually contained within a parking facilities bylaw rather than in the zoning bylaw. And then we also have some other regulations. So, for example, in Oak Bay, we have a paving regulation that essentially limits the amount of paving that can be put in the front yard and rear yard. And then we also control essentially how much a building can cover of a lot through a lot coverage calculation. So each of the zones has a different lot coverage calculation to ensure that buildings are not essentially being built on all of the green space and just limited to a certain percentage of the site. And then we also have what's called a floor area ratio, which is one way to control the massing of buildings relative to a lot size, calculated by dividing the total floor area of a building with some exemptions by the area of the parcel of land to give essentially a ratio, and that's contained within the bylaw and is used as in the District of Oak Bay, used to be a measure of density. And so I am just going to now hand over to Jeanette Elmo, who works for our consultant that was appointed to undertake the required zoning bylaw changes. Jeanette Elmo is from a company called Modus Planning and Design and Engagement out of Vancouver. And so Jeanette will take us through some of those required zoning changes and how the district is proposing to meet some of those requirements that has been set by the province.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Green. As presented by Mr. Green, Bill 44 requires that the district update its zoning bylaw to enable the minimum densities by June 30th. And there are a number of different approaches that could be taken to meet the provincial mandate, and a number of recommended options are proposed over the next slides that balance Oak Bay's unique context with the technical analysis, the provincial site standards, community input, and the infill housing strategy. This current approach may be considered as an introductory implementation of the infill strategy and is expected to be iterative, allowing for additional future bylaw amendments. Next slide, thank you. Our public outreach on this process has included several events to inform and consult with members of the public. That includes a virtual webinar that was held on April 25th, where we had 90 attendees signed in, and 2 open houses, the first on May 1st, and we had 220 attendees, at least noted, coming in, counted, and another open house on Saturday, May 4th, where 120 attendees were noted. We also have this event tonight. We've had a great turnout and some very informative conversations with community members. We had 64 survey responses, and the majority do live in Oak Bay. Response overall appeared to be positive about receiving clear information, useful discussions, and learning opportunities. We also found that for the most part, people felt heard. Moving into the options for the zoning bylaw update, this map shows the district's current zoning and parcels that are subject to the small-scale multi-unit housing, the SMA legislation. And we'll go through these zones in greater detail in the next few slides. To highlight key changes, we've grouped zones by relative size and category of permitted uses. The intent of the zoning bylaw amendment is to meet the provincial requirements and address the district's housing strategy, infill housing strategy. Over the past 6 weeks, options have been developed and tested for adjusting the zoning bylaw to meet the province's minimum densities. Our technical analysis has included modeling and analysis of build-out under various scenarios. And although the options presented remain tentative, we will be reviewing the public input as well as reviewing these options as the bylaw is drafted. And each of these refinements might amend the preferred options prior to presenting them to Council for direction in early June. The first of the zones that we are considering are the larger lot zones, the RS1, RS2, and RS3. These are shown in pale yellow on the map, and they range in size from minimum lot size of about 1 acre in the RS1 and half an acre in the RS2 to 1/4 of an acre in the RS3. The majority of these RS1 and RS2 parcels are in uplands, but they're also found throughout the district. We know that the community cherishes permeable space, tree protection, existing neighborhood character, and our proposed approach aims to minimize changes while meeting the provincial requirements and right-sizing future development. In general, the recommended changes align with the province by allowing the minimum densities of 3 or 4 units, 4 units on parcels that are up to 1 acre in size. In the case of parcels that are over 1 acre in size, the province actually recommends fewer units, meaning 1 principal building and a secondary suite and/or an additional dwelling unit, because these are considered to have future potential by the province. Overall, the approach involves retaining existing heights, setbacks, and site coverage provisions, although adjusting maximum permitted floor areas and removing the minimum unit size while reducing parking for infill housing and allowing a mix of housing sizes and forms. We created a number of models to analyze and illustrate the proposed options for zoning parameters. Note that future work will be done to confirm infill housing forms that are most appropriate for Oak Bay. But these models do show a number of configurations that could conceptually be built under the proposed parameters. Over on the left, we're showing a fourplex, and in the middle we have, we have 2 townhouses above a ground floor flat and an accessory dwelling unit in the rear, which could be a garden suite or a laneway house. And then over on the right could be a row of 4 townhouses with driveway along the side and parking in the rear. Starting to look at some of the specific recommended changes to the zoning parameters, we're highlighting recommended options in the following slides. This first slide is highlighting proposed recommendations to maximum roof height. And in the column to the left that's highlighted, we are illustrating what the provincial site standard is. The province is benchmarking a roof height of up to 11 meters. However, we found with our modeling and calculations that on these large lots, livable infill housing can reasonably be achieved without raising the building heights. Now, we have proposed that the calculation of height be rounded up. So the current existing maximum roof height in these zones is 9.14 meters, And the proposal, for the sake of simplifying the zoning bylaw, would be to round that number up to 9.2. Parking is a significant factor to balance with numerous competing objectives. The Provincial Policy Manual recommends 1 stall per unit in communities like Oak Bay, compared with the existing, which requires 2 parking spaces per detached unit. The provincial benchmark is a reasonable minimum for infill housing, especially when considering factors of site coverage, tree canopy retention, and vehicle use in suburban neighborhoods. Note that this recommendation for 1 space per unit would be a minimum requirement, not a maximum. So these minimums would not prevent a landowner or developer or homeowner from having more than 1 parking space per unit. In terms of floor area ratio, our technical analysis did identify that the currently permitted floor area ratios on these larger lots could result in overly large masses, which is contrary to goals of creating more housing. And these floor area ratios would create large masses either for single detached units or when the overall mass is divided into 4 units for infill housing. So it is recommended that the FAR be adjusted downward for the RS1 and the RS2, especially for the single detached forms. We found that in an RS1 single detached form, 0.2 FAR is still more than generous, where 0.25 would moderately incentivize infill housing. Likewise with the RS2 zone, which is the half acre, changing the existing FAR from 0.4 down to 0.3 is reasonable for a single detached form, and leaving the FAR at 0.4 for infill housing is reasonable. In the RS3, the quarter acre size minimum lot, 0.4 is reasonable for single detached, but a small bump up for infill housing would help to incentivize that form. On this slide, we are showing all recommended options for enabling and incentivizing infill housing in the larger lot zones. Do note that no changes are recommended at this time to the minimum lot sizes. Thank you. Now we'll get into the smaller lot zones, the RS4, RS5, RS5B, CD2, and RD1, which are shown in the yellow on this map and do make up the bulk of the residential, of all zones in Oak Bay, really. Again, with the recommended changes, we are recognizing the importance of preserving permeable space and tree canopy while meeting the density requirements of these zones. So in this case, the options need careful consideration of trade-offs of various objectives. Our proposed approach aims to strike a balance and preserve permeable space while ensuring that infill units are livable and can be developed reasonably. While permitting 3 to 4 units, the key changes recommended include removing floor area ratio controls, reducing parking requirements, and increasing height in the RS5. Next slide. Thank you. Here again, we've done some modeling to illustrate how these housing forms may be accommodated into the community. Keep in mind that these models are illustrating a maximum build-out situation and may not result in such masses, but as shown, they generally fit within the scale of the existing neighborhood. Again, like in the previous slides on the larger lot zones, here we have highlighted existing and recommended parameters for each of the zones, starting with the parameters suggested through the Provincial Policy Manual. Starting with front yard setback, the provincial benchmark for these smaller zones is 2 meters, And we found that that would be quite a drastic change from the existing neighborhood character and street patterning in Oak Bay, and likely has impacts on tree canopy, where the majority of older trees are located in the front yards and boulevards. So we are recommending an option to consider reducing front yard setbacks to 6 meters from the existing 7.6 in most cases in the RS4 and in the RS5. So that would respond to the provincial guidance to reduce front yard setbacks and improve siting flexibility, while also leaving space for front yard parking. In general, the changes to side yard setbacks are not recommended at this time. However, in the case of the RS5B and CD2 and the RD1 zones, these are all fairly site-specific zones in Oak Bay with minimal application, and with the required provincial densities, there is a case to be made to consolidate these 3 zones with the RS5. And in this case, it's recommended that any parameters that would result in a non-conforming use through consolidation, that those be either preserved through site-specific mention in the zoning bylaw, or that they be blended in with any updates that are adopted to the RS5 zone. So in the case of rear and side yard setbacks in the RS5B and CD2 zone, we might see some site-specific setbacks that are preserved on those existing lots. Raising heights, raising the maximum roof height is an amendment recommended, especially for the smaller lots. And this has significant potential to improve livability for infill housing forms. The provincial benchmark is 11 meters. And we did find that raising the roof height will improve livability, but 11 meters is likely not necessary in the context of Oak Bay and would alter the form of housing. But by allowing higher heights in the smaller lot zones and removing the need to calculate height based on lot breadth, as is the current requirement in the zoning bylaw, the infill housing forms on these lots are greatly improved and even incentivized. It's not, however, recommended that roof heights be increased for all housing forms. So for single detached, we would consider proposing an option where single detached and infill housing have different maximum roof heights. Again, in this case, for the smaller lot zones, in the case of consolidation, we recommend changes to site coverage only where site-specific parameters, only where non-conformance on these sites would be a concern. So, for example, in the CD2 zone, where the existing site coverage is permitted to be 34.5 on one of the lots, there may be a site-specific regulation that enables that lot to continue that coverage so that a non-conforming use doesn't occur. Again, accommodating parking is one of the most important considerations for accessibility, livability, and neighborhood character. Our recommended approach considered the provincial policy manual and existing parking requirements, as well as siting, impermeable site coverage, and tree canopy. Where the provincial policy manual recommends up to 1 space per unit within communities like Oak Bay, we found that this minimum cannot be easily accommodated, especially on these smaller lots, without risking large extents of paved area in front yards and overall in the parcels. Bumping that stall ratio down to 0.75 allows for on-site parking for residents, but minimizes impacts on gardens and trees and groundwater infiltration. Also keep in mind that the site standards the provincial site standards for parking require 0 parking stalls where a parcel is within 400 meters of a frequent transit network. So that doesn't apply to Oak Bay, but the site standards also recommend reductions to 0.5 in many cases. Also keep in mind that if parking minimums are reduced, it doesn't prevent a homeowner or a landowner from having more parking, as long as that fits within the maximum paved surface areas that are allowed through the zoning bylaw. Current floor area ratio limitations is another metric that poses a great barrier to achieving infill housing, let alone incentivizing the development of new units. 0.4 FAR results in fairly small single detached homes, and when divided by 4 units, would not create livable unit sizes. Because massing in these zones is restricted by site coverage and height regulations, an option to consider would be to remove FAR restrictions entirely, as this would also ease the review and development of infill housing. In general, minimum parcel sizes are not being recommended to be changed as part of this current work. However, for the RD1 zone, the duplex zone, which has limited applicability in the district, there are 2 lots zoned RD1. It is recommended that that zone be consolidated with the RS5 and that the minimum lot size reflect the current RS5 zone. In the case of the CD2 and the, especially the CD2 zone where the permitted lot sizes are smaller, then that wouldn't be affected by consolidating that zone with the RS5. As is shown in this slide, there are more changes to the parameters recommended in the small lot zones due to the constraints to achieving infill housing. Wherever possible, recommended changes to the parameters reflect the provincial site standards, Oak Bay's context, the infill housing strategy, and other benefits to the neighborhood and the community. Of special mention are the heritage designated properties. We know that heritage and sustainability are important values to the community, and heritage homes across the district will remain protected through heritage designation bylaw and other tools available like the heritage revitalization permits. In accordance with provincial requirements, heritage designated properties are proposed to allow 1 detached unit with a secondary suite and/or an additional dwelling unit. This is a similar approach, this is the same approach actually, as is proposed for lots larger than 1 acre, and it follows the provincial guidance. There are other zones in the district that technically qualify as restricted zones under the provincial definition. And this includes 3 commercial mixed-use zones and all of the district's multifamily zones. In these cases, residential uses are restricted to single detached where minimum lot sizes aren't achieved, and therefore qualify as restricted zones under certain conditions. As a result, the district must consider these as part of their bylaw amendments to allow the minimum densities. These zones all reference the regulations for the RS5 zone. So it is recommended that these zones be updated to reflect whatever changes are adopted to the RS5 as well. The exception here is that in the mixed-use commercial zones, they would permit up to 4 apartment units above grade or above commercial at grade rather than infill housing, as that option would make more sense in the location where these commercial uses are situated. We've presented a number of options tonight to enable infill housing through the zoning bylaw and the parking facilities bylaw amendments. Other options to consider could include, on larger lots, allowing up to a maximum of 4 units, and also removing floor area ratio in favor of other site control, similar to the recommended approach for the smaller lots. On smaller lots, further options to consider would include different parameters for parking, height, setbacks, and lot coverage requirements. And finally, for heritage designated properties, the district could consider allowing up to a maximum of 4 units rather than 3. Several other bylaw amendments are recommended as options at this time, primarily for the purposes of simplifying the zoning bylaw and easing the implementation of infill housing in the district. Some of these other bylaw changes could consider removing the requirement for covered parking to encourage residential floor area, simplifying the calculation of building heights by removing the occupiable height concept from the zoning bylaw. Bylaw changes could consider removing the contextual front line setback rule for ease of implementation, as well as removing the variable rear setback calculation, which is a calculation that allows for a rear setback at either 25% of lot depth or 7.6 meters, whichever is greater. There may be other related provisions in the zoning bylaw that will be identified through the process of drafting the bylaw amendment. At this time, there are a number of topics that have not been considered for recommended changes, although there are future steps in the implementation of the infill housing strategy. Topics where no changes are recommended at this time include looking at owner occupancy requirements for secondary suites, any options that would change stratification or tenure, so that means ownership or rental of units. We're not recommending any changes that would prescribe housing forms or number of buildings on a parcel, although the existing and proposed parameters would pose limitations or barriers to these. And at this time, there's no recommendation to change subdivision or minimum lot sizes. Thank you. I believe this is where I hand the presentation back over to the Director of Planning. And thank you for your time tonight.
Welcome back, Mr. Boel.
Thanks, Jeanette. Thanks, Mayor. Next steps. This is the closing to the end of the presentation. So the changes that we are discussing today, we intend to draft a zoning bylaw in the coming weeks that will be presented to Council on June the 3rd for consideration of first and second reading, and then in time for the deadline of June 30th. Whatever changes that Council approves would be coming forward again on June 24th for adoption. As mentioned earlier, there are also other bylaw amendments needed for infill housing, and they would follow separately over the summer. A couple of things to note here is that right now we are not making changes, or we don't intend to make changes to the requirement for development permits for larger infill housing developments or for infill housing, but we do need to change the OCP to make sure that that tool would continue to apply. And then other changes to the OCP would be to update our development permit guidelines. These are guidelines for the form and character of infill housing, and some changes are needed both in response to provincial guidelines, but also to take a closer look at how exactly what kind of guidelines would be in place for up to 4 units. Then, as mentioned, other bylaws would need to be changed as well, including the bylaws related to parking, driveways, tree protection, subdivision, and finally, but a separate project, amenity cost charges and development cost charges program will follow later this year. And the other projects, I made reference to this at the start, but there are other projects as well coming later this year and next year for housing needs assessments, multifamily designations, commercial and mixed use designations, and as well as making changes to the zone, further changes to the zoning bylaw next year. That concludes our presentation, Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boel. Just to remind everybody, we're going to just take a few questions from members of council. I'm sort of asking 4 minutes per person if I can do that. That'll take us to about half an hour. Then we'll go to members of the public to get comments, questions, and then back to this table for some discussion. Doesn't really matter what order I go in, so I'll just take hands. Anybody wish to go first? Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite.
Thank you so much, Mayor. I have just 2 questions, I think. The first one would be in regards to the uplands. Do we have any further information in regards to if the uplands is going to be handled differently because it falls under the Special Powers Act, if it's going to be handled differently to the rest of Oak Bay yet?
Mr. Boel?
Thank you, Mayor. Through you. This not really. The short answer is no. The uplands area falls under the same legislation, needs to have the same ability for infill housing. The Special Powers Act continues to be in place, so that is our form and character control in that area. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'll
Mr.
wait
Boel,
for the
just
tech
project
to...
a bit more and we'll be fine.
Let's try again. Is my voice back? Yes, I think so. Okay. Maybe somebody can tune me up. Testing, testing. Maybe closer? I'll do that. All right. What about now? And I'll speak up as well. Is that better? Okay. Back to the question then. Uplands. So yes, uplands needs to follow the same requirements. The Special Powers Act is our form and character control in the area, and that one is not proposed to change at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Braithwaite. The short answer is the same rules apply within the uplands as outside the uplands. That helps. What we do have is some possibility on the zoning to change the setbacks and so forth, and that's what the RS 1, 2, and 3 are in these considerations. That helps. Go ahead.
Thank you. And also then my other question is around the FAR for the smaller lots. You talked about there being no FAR for the smaller lots, and some people ask me about that and about how that affects if there's still going to be minimum setbacks, etc., or does it mean that people can build from one end of their lot to the other? So probably a clarification of that would be good. Thank you, Mayor.
Mr. Boel?
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, these changes, as Jeanette was referring to as well, there's other site controls on smaller lots. So by limiting the height, the setbacks, lot coverage, there are still limits on smaller lots for building area. So that's a different way to control building size and make sure that they are similar, but a little bit larger than what currently can be constructed. Thank you.
Thank you. Who wishes to go ahead? Go ahead, Councillor Green and Watson. Oh, just go ahead. It's okay, Councillor Green. Go ahead, and then I'll have Councillor Patterson next.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. Just a question on infrastructure upgrades and repairs and so on. We will need to assess the ability or capacity of our infrastructure in Oak Bay to accommodate new housing units. Will that be part of our assessment? And the second question, I'll cover them both quickly. The other one is that people are very concerned about the preservation of green space, tree canopies, and so on. How will we preserve those things that are also related to climate change mitigation? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. Should I go to Mr. Robertson for the infrastructure question? Mr. Robertson is our Director of Engineering and Public Works. Welcome.
Thank you. Through the Mayor, the utilities, the underground utilities will all have, we're in the middle of assessing right now, and we'll be reporting to council shortly about the state of the utilities. As far as capacity goes, it's really on a case-by-case basis as we see where development happens, because we can't predict that and model the whole system over again. But it would be as we see them come in, and where we can see places where we would need to do upsizing to accommodate.
Thank you.
And the second question was just around protection of green space. Mr. Boel?
Thank you, Mayor. Ms. Elmore could give us an answer on that.
Welcome back, Ms. Elmore.
The green space and tree canopy were significant considerations in our recommendations of these options. Please notice in the slides the parameters for lot coverage. If we could go there, the provincial recommendation for lot coverage is 50% in the small lot zones, which is significantly higher than the existing and the recommended site coverage for the updated zones. Site coverage is one of the most important aspects of preserving permeable space and green space and tree canopy. So we felt that this was important to not increase up to the 50% recommended by the province. We also looked carefully at all setbacks, and tree canopy was one of the major reasons that we didn't recommend reducing the front yard setback any more than 6 meters, because of the location of street trees and front yard trees in that location. We also are not recommending reductions to the rear yard setbacks because of the likelihood of having usable green space, garden space, and trees in rear yards. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Green. I'll have Councillor Patterson, then Watson.
Thank you, Mayor, and through you to thank you. Just to follow up on a few questions about the, particularly the smaller lots. There are many areas in the District of Oak Bay that have overhead utility lines, and so if we have multiple dwellings on a small lot, does that mean multiple transmission lines into the lot, or would there be a plan to somehow combine the services to feed to the lot and then feed out to the structures?
I'll give that one to Mr. Robertson.
Through the mayor, as we're not responsible for the overhead hydro or communications lines, that would be something that would have to be taken up with those utilities to see how they would address that.
Councillor Patterson.
Thank you. And again, following on for the smaller lots, there are many streets in Oak Bay that don't have sidewalks presently, and with the reduced setbacks of what is being proposed tonight, that could potentially force parking out into the streets. Many are becoming congested already, but it will also not then allow any room for safe pedestrian transportation on those streets. And so I'm wondering what has been discussed or planned for those locations.
I'm not sure where to go for that one. Mr. Boel.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. So for parking, our expectations are that required parking is located on site at all times. Of course, streets do offer street parking, overflow parking for busier options or events maybe. We haven't specifically looked at street and street profiles, but focused on what is the parking that would be required on site. Yeah, maybe that is a topic down the road for this summer to look at, but the expectation is that parking is provided on site. Thank you.
Anything else, Councillor Patterson?
Just to follow up on that, we have not yet seen the pedestrian or pavement planning come before council, so I'm wondering if there will be anything contained within that report that might offer more information on this.
Mr. Robertson?
through the mayor. That report will be coming, I believe it's June, but it will not have anything that directly relates to this. It's more on condition assessment, and for the sidewalk master plan, there will be a discussion there about potential infill for sidewalks and expansion areas for future, but nothing linked specifically to this.
Thank you.
Through the chair, I can just also add that we will need to revisit our subdivision bylaw as well to ensure that we can potentially secure frontage improvements at building permit stage, but particularly if applications aren't going through a subdivision process, we do have the ability through the Local Government Act to secure frontage improvements through a building permit under Section 506, I think it is. So that is something that we'll be looking at when we review the subdivision bylaw with colleagues in engineering.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Anything else, Councillor Patterson?
Yes, just one last question I'd like to ask. I know that in adjacent municipalities, as they embarked on doing infill housing, they also displaced many of the most vulnerable or low rental units within the districts. So I'm wondering, in addition to tracking the new units that are going in, will we also be monitoring, or do we have any methodology for monitoring the loss of particularly small older homes that do provide some low-cost rental housing within the district, so that we know what we are giving up for what we're gaining?
Mr. Boel?
Through the mayor, we currently don't track that actively. We do need a report on demolitions and net new units, but we currently don't track any details on what is demolished or removed. It could be considered as part of our tracking that we are expanding because of the need to report to the province, but that would need to be included then in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, and going next to Councillor Watson, then I have Smart and Appleton.
Thank you, Mayor. And through you, please, to staff. I have got 4 questions circled here in no particular order. Just with respect to the slide that indicates some things, no recommendation for change, and one of them is stratification and tenure. And if you could just clarify, if we are silent on that, does that mean that stratification would be permitted for everything except an accessory suite or a secondary suite?
Mr. Boel?
Yes, that is indeed the case.
Thank you. Secondly, with respect to commercial zones, there's a proposal that, or it noted in one of the slides that with the consolidation of the zoning or changes to the zoning, we up to 4 units above commercial would be permitted. Would this prevent housing from being built at grade? Are we suggesting that it's only housing that is installed above some other use that's not residential?
Mr. Boel?
That's indeed the case. So right now these sites already have commercial at the ground level, but they could not be reverted back to residential use under the new regulation. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to double check, so that if somebody actually tore down the building that existed, they would need to still replace commercial at grade with residential above. Thank you. Next question, and this is with respect to site coverage. I just wanted to know, is gravel considered to be paving?
Mr. Green?
Through the chair, yes, that is under our current definition of, I think it's on the definition of paving. We include gravel is considered to be a hard surface, basically. Yeah, a paving surface.
Thank you. And just one final question. Because there is a recommendation that other things are going to be changed, but rather arcane terms are used to describe these things. I just wonder if you could, for everybody's benefit here, just explain occupiable height, contextual front setback, and variable rear setback.
Mr. Green?
In 30 seconds or less.
Yes, 30 seconds or less.
the contextual front setback requires a formula to be used to calculate the front setback based on the location and siting of the two adjacent houses to a lot. And so it does cause quite a bit of confusion, because when we receive applications, usually they submit a survey just of the said lot that's subject to the application, and then we have to send them back, and they then have to go send the surveyor out to do the survey on the two adjacent buildings. So it does slow down the process for a development variance permit in relation to that front contextual setback. The occupiable height, even I struggle understanding that definition sometimes, and it's a shame that we don't have our plan checker in the room who deals with that, but it's my understanding that occupiable height is essentially the height of the building to the lowest floor of the building. And so it's not the height of the building, it's to the floor of the building, but it's a one that causes me confusion. And the third one was, sorry, what was the third definition? Or
Variable rear setback.
So that's where basically it's either 7.6 metres or 25% of the lot depth, whichever is the greater, then becomes the rear yard setback. Again, quite an unusual requirement.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And just to follow up on that, thanks for explaining those three things and contextual front setback. Is the purpose behind having a contextual front setback to try and ensure some consistent patterning of frontages?
Go ahead, Mr. Green.
Through the chair, I think that was the intent, that it's in trying to ensure that essentially the rhythm of the street follows that context. However, it's based on the existing context rather than necessarily what the future context may be, which is also, I think, an important consideration in relation to planning for the future.
Thank you very much. That's everything.
Thank you very much, Councillor Watson. I have Councillor Smart and then Appleton.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor, to staff. With regards to big picture goals utilized, I'm wondering, was staff able to look at a strategy for preserving existing housing stock with regards to the rear setbacks? And with that question, what I'm getting at is, the hopeful aspect of preserving as much of our existing housing stock as possible and people wanting to put accessory dwelling units in their backyard. But obviously, if the rear setbacks are so large, it might encourage a full demolition of the house in order to maximize development. And I wondered if amongst all the work staff had to do, if they had the capacity to sort of look at that and think about whether it was worth reducing the rear property setback.
Mr. Boel, I think that one's for you.
Yeah, thank you. We haven't looked at that in detail because we were mainly testing over the last couple of months what needs to be changed and what could stay the same. But this is definitely something that could be further explored over the summer, perhaps, or if council asks us to do it earlier, we would need to look into it. But right now, with the setback staying the same, depending on where the existing house is, if there's not a lot of space at the back, there would be not that much space for infill housing. That said, setbacks could be varied typically. So if there was a scenario where there was space, or there could be space if only the rear setback was varied, that could definitely be a site-specific proposal in the future. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor, to staff, I wondered also if staff, in looking at choosing building heights, considered the accessibility of secondary suites, particularly with the future language around potentially 2 stories and the basement exemption, and looking at potentially the flexibility to have a more accessible secondary suite, and not to encourage that and not to make it punitive.
Sure, Ms. Elmore. People are wondering where Ms. Elmore is. She's in Vancouver, calling us in. So if you're looking around for which staff person is speaking, that's where she is. Welcome back, Ms. Elmore.
Thank you. Through the chair, do I understand the question is about enabling usable additional dwelling units, or accessible in the sense of accessible features?
Go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Accessible in that it might be desired to have the lowest floor or the basement just say 4 or 5 feet below grade, and then have in order to ramp down and create an accessible secondary suite while still having 2 stories of livable space above. And under the current zoning requirements, it wouldn't encourage designing accessible suites because you'd have to have them quite low. We'd end up with lots of window wells and less daylight and less views for those secondary suites. So I just wondered if that was taken into consideration when the heights were considered.
Ms. Elmore?
Through the chair, thank you for clarifying. The proposed option for accessory dwelling unit heights would be up to 6 meters. And there's no restriction on where ground floors could be located. A great amount of flexibility could also be permitted within principal buildings.
Anything else?
Thank you. I'm going to go until you cut me off. I'm wondering if there can be, through you, Mayor, to staff, can there be considerations on corner lots and laneway suites to have increased lot coverage?
Ms. Elmore?
Thank you. Through the chair, that is certainly an option that could be explored. The current proposed reflects what is currently in place and reflects current neighborhood patterning and preserves open space. However, increasing lot coverage could improve flexibility in terms of units and floor area of units. Thank you.
Councillor Smart?
Thank you. With regards to trying to minimize having 3 or 4 parking spots per site, I'm wondering if staff considered the possibility of having a prescriptive transportation demand management chart, such as we've seen in the City of Victoria's missing middle housing policy, that would allow exemptions for bus passes and car share options in lieu of parking spots. Is that something that we could consider now or at a later date?
Ms. Elmore?
Through the chair, I will defer to the Director of Planning. Thank you.
Of course, Director Boel.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, right now we don't delve into these other details so much. That is a bit of a bigger question, and we have talked about the parking facilities bylaw a couple of times, and there is a bigger project down the road where we would look at that. In this particular case for Infill housing, the requirement for electric charging for scooters, bicycles, maybe that remains in place. It's already in the bylaw. And on in terms of passes and whatnot, that's much more evolved. That would be in a much bigger program where the district would need to consider if that's something that either we can require from homeowners or developers, or if there's a program that the district would intend to do, and that's beyond the scope of this particular program development at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else, Councillor Smart?
Yes, through you, Mayor, to staff. Could you clarify, are we eliminating the combined setbacks and the additional side yard setback required at the second floor in some zones?
Thank you, Mr. Boel. Oh, Ms. Elmore.
Through the chair, I'm happy to answer that. There's no recommendation to remove those setbacks at this time.
Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor, to staff. I just wondered, has staff been working with the province at all, or will these recommendations, if implemented, be a surprise to the province? And I ask that just because some of our implementations are so different from the provincial guidance, and I wonder if staff is at all concerned about risking the province coming in and changing things for us if we're not appearing to encourage more housing.
Mr. Boel?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. The province is not really available to us to run draft proposals, and I think besides, it's clear through the manual and for the legislation what is required and what needs to be considered, and we've also gotten some further information on that. I've been in touch with other communities. What we're trying to do, what is the provincial expectation is that we include the 4 units per lot, and we consider the guidelines and the setbacks and things that they're recommending with the goal of facilitating infill housing. And that's the key thing here. I think through the work with our consultants at Modus, we have seen that we don't need to make that many changes to show that there is a very reasonable amount of floor area available on these lots throughout Oak Bay that would allow for the infill housing. So in that sense, we are very comfortable with the current proposal that would meet the intent of the provincial legislation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Councillor Appleton next.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you to staff. I'm just wondering whether I can get a little bit of clarification on the question of reducing the FAR on larger lot sizes, and in terms of what the mechanism is by which that incentivizes infill.
Ms. Elmore?
Through the chair, thank you. The incentive would simply be to enable slightly higher FAR where an owner developer builds 3 or more units. Thank you.
Councillor Appleton?
Thank you, Your Worship. So just to follow up on that, I'm not sure I necessarily understand the mechanism there. Again, for the purposes of explaining this to the public who are looking at redeveloped scenarios on these larger lot sizes, a reduction in FAR could be considered to be, a significant departure from existing building form. What would an alternative building form under the proposed new scheme look like, given these FAR restrictions on a larger lot? So I know folks have been approaching council and speaking to council about the larger lots, especially in things like uplands, and talking about what form and character looks like on those lots. What is this proposed change likely to manifest itself as?
Ms. Elmore?
Thank you. Through the chair, I can give greater description and some calculations to go along with that. What we found when looking at a 1 acre parcel, which is the minimum lot size in the RS1 zone, a 0.4 floor area ratio, which is a ratio that relates to the lot size and results in a total built floor area. When we have a 0.4 FAR, which is what is currently permitted in the zoning bylaw, thank you, a typical RS1 lot could result in 17,000 square feet of built area in a single detached form. That could also include attached garages or accessory buildings. However, 17,000 square feet is a very large home. And it seemed contrary to the existing pattern and intent of the neighborhoods, especially up in uplands, for example. So we then ran that calculation of 43,000 square foot lot, so 1 acre, and multiplied that by a 0.2 FAR. That still results in over 8,000 square feet of built area. Now, Mr. Green can speak to the type of development applications that are received in the uplands, but an 8,000 square foot home, including accessory buildings, is still large, but it's not a 17,000 square foot home. We felt that when 8,000 is divided by 4, such as an infill situation might be with 4 units, the average unit size would be 2,000 square feet. So we felt that an option could consider a slight incentive in these zones where the floor area ratio, where more than 2 units, more than a single detached and a secondary suite, for example, are developed on a lot, there could be a slight floor area bonus for developing more than 2 units. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Elmore. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a second question. Wondering whether staff can speak to the retaining the requirement for the infill DPA for new housing under this policy. And I'm just wondering, is that bringing us into conflict with provincial policy? And is there a potential opportunity for accelerated process or potentially less staff work if we dispense with the DPA or dispense with it under certain circumstances?
Thank you, Councillor Appleton. Mr. Boel?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll start with how the current tool works in our official community plan. So right now, development permit would be required for infill housing that requires a rezoning. But once these changes are made by the end of June, there would be no rezoning typically for infill housing anymore. So the tool would become defunct if we wouldn't make any changes. What we intend to do, assuming that we would continue to want to control form and character for infill housing, is making sure that we change the official community plan to make sure it points to probably a certain size of building so that that continues to apply. In relation to the provincial guidance, is the province is recommending or suggesting against development, form and character control and the use of advisory design panels. But there's a couple of different ways the district could still do that, because this is in the realm of consider, not required. So we could still require it ourselves, the development permit that is. Right now, development permits go to council. There's also options to delegate that to staff or only require development permits in certain rare circumstances. Another option is to require advisory design panel review or not. So there's a couple of variables there, all the way to not requiring a development permit in the first place, which is the provincial preferred option. Yeah, I think that answers the question, unless I missed a part of it. I'm sorry.
Councillor Appleton?
Thank you, Your Worship. So just to follow up through you to staff. So essentially, we're talking about a broad-based change from in the existing scheme. Infill development, as mentioned, would generally require a rezoning, or often require a rezoning or potentially a spot zone. We're talking about shifting that essentially to more of a form and character DPA, and with the associated OCP amendment is attached to that. So a lot of the form and character deliverables that we would seek to accomplish through these types of discussions would be delivered through such a DPA.
Mr. Boel?
Yes, that's correct.
Anything else, Councillor Appleton? All right, thank you. I just have a few questions, and we'll get to the public. So if you have questions, get them ready. And we'll take questions both online and in person. So up here. Just curious, the current, when we went through the secondary suite process and long discussion about parking, we settled on a model that established a policy based on the number of bedrooms, so up to 4 bedrooms. I think it was sort of standard parking spots, and if the total number of suites and building units scaled beyond that, and for every, I think, additional 2 bedrooms, there was additional some requirement. I'm just curious, was that continuity of that policy continued? It seems to have a certain amount of wisdom in that there's a sort of a standard amount, very similar to what's now, but it scales with the number of units, but really with the number of people living there, because it's the number of bedrooms. So curious if that was contemplated as part of the options. I guess that would go to Ms. Elmore. Ms. Elmore?
Thank you. Through the chair, yes, that was an option that was considered and discussed. What we found was that the provincial site standards recommend 1 space per unit for infill housing. And because infill housing tends to be smaller forms, especially on smaller lots, bedroom counts would be lower. So in combination with the provincial site standard recommendation, the usable lot area, as well as the logic that is tied to lower parking requirements being required for rental housing and smaller units, which we expect, we felt that 1 space per unit or less would be reasonable in the context of infill housing.
Thank you for that explanation.
Thank you.
The other question I have is, it's discussed here roof height. I'm curious, I couldn't quite get clarity within the documents here. Is that the total roof height? So if it's a flat roof to the top of the roof, the flat roof, and is it the top of a peaked roof as well, or is it like midway up an angled span? Because those have different ramifications in terms of look and feel. I guess through me to Ms. Elmore.
Thank you, through the chair. Yes, the district has 3 current definitions for the height of a home, including building height and roof height. Roof height measures total height to the peak of a roof or to the top of a flat roof, where building height generally goes to the top of the highest wall. Does that answer the question? Thank you.
So what would be the proposal here when we're talking about 10 meters of height? What is that to?
Through the chair, that would be to the top of the roof, and the building height could be extrapolated from that.
Okay, so a flat roof building would be the equivalent of the peak of a peaked roof.
Correct. However, building height is still to be determined, but the recommended option would be in line with what is currently permitted, but slightly higher.
Okay, thank you.
So you're welcome. Thank you.
Second from last question, the discussion I think with Councillor, I think it was Smart, raised it was just the rear yard setback to 7.6 meters. But there's, I think, a footnote there that could change for an accessory dwelling unit. Are those changes contemplated within this initial change? I think I agree that's likely a common ask would be for a carriage house or a backyard house. Through me to Ms. Elmore.
Through the chair, thank you. Yes, the recommendation is that rear setbacks for accessory dwelling units be 1.5 meters or as little as 0.6 where there's a lane present.
Okay, thank you for that detail. And the last question I had, I know it's been touched on sort of generally, but perhaps there can just be a little bit more explanation of the departure away from FAR. I appreciate the province doesn't see that as their preferred model, but I look at the wide range of housing units or styles that are contemplated here, everything from multiple small cottages to accelerated dwelling units to single buildings with multiple units inside of it. And it would seem like the floor area ratio as a tool just to allow the maximal flexibility while still sort of effectively controlling the total massing on the lot would be a reasonable approach. So I'm curious if that was changed just because the province isn't recommending it, or if there's some additional benefits to the approach taken. Ms. Elmore?
Through the chair, thank you. There was strong consideration for this element of the recommendations. It was found that the current FAR, especially in the constrained smaller lot RS4 and RS5 lots, adds additional complexity in addition to the FAR exemption for those particular zones. And it felt like it was an opportunity to meet the site standards and simplify the zoning bylaw while having minimal negative impact in other areas of controlling massing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Just then for my clarification on that, these are, by using the external setbacks, maximal height, that would naturally, I would suspect, encourage people to build a large cubic building to maximize those areas. Is there anything within the proposed, and one of those nuances of the exemptions and so forth within the current FAR, are they intended to kind of create incentives to soften some of the street impacts? Could you just talk, is there anything within the proposed changes here, Ms. Elmore, that would allow for, I guess, some softening or some encouragement of what are really sort of visible changes in roof slope or features like verandas and so forth that help soften the streetscape? Are there any sort of contemplations of keeping some of those or other new tools to encourage the streetscape besides? I'm with Councillor Appleton here. I'm not sure we really want to go through a more complicated process on every application. If there's ways that we can build it directly into the zoning. So a bit of a complicated question there, but over to you, Ms. Elmore.
Through the chair, thank you very much. That's an important consideration and a comment. The removal of FAR should probably only be considered alongside the application of a development permit area.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I'll leave my questions and comments at this point, and go to the members of the public. So we are, just for everybody's education, I should have mapped out this evening. We're about 20 minutes behind where I hope we'd be at this point, which isn't too bad. But at this point, I'm going to invite members of the public to come forward. You can come up to the microphone. It's the simplest thing. If you are more comfortable speaking, it's easier if we form a line. Particularly if you have mobility challenges or can't stand for a long period, then you just put up your hand, and Matt at the back there will come around with the microphone. Process here is the same as it is at all of our council meetings, which is just you have to state your full name and just your municipality of residence. You don't have to give us your address. There's a sign-in sheet there as well, so it helps us get your name spelled right in the minutes. Welcome. You can be a good example here for the first one.
The mic is on, okay. As you all know, I'm a heritage advocate. And one of the points
Can you
here...
just state your name and municipality of residence to start, Ms. Wilson?
Pat Wilson, South Oak Bay. Anyway, one of the guiding principles was cherish what the community loves. And I listen to what's being said about moving the front yard setback forward, is the way I understood that, and requiring parking, but not limiting the paved area in the front yard for parking. Well, if we're densifying, what we do need is green space.
I'm going to just turn that into a question, if you don't mind. I'll let you continue. But to Ms. Elmore, are there changes contemplated to the maximum 25% front yard paving that we currently have?
Through the chair, yes, the amount of paved space in the front yard will need to be increased above 25% should minimum parking not be reduced or eliminated. Unfortunately, it is not possible to enable more than 2 stalls in a front yard without resulting in more than 25% of paving of some kind.
Can you give us an approximate number, Ms. Elmore?
We were seeing about 40 or 50% in the small lot front yards where there are 3 parking stalls.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Now, my next point is we love our character and heritage houses. I don't see any incentives in here to keep these houses and bonus density or something, waiving charges. There doesn't seem to be anything like that that will help keep our neighborhood retain some of its similarity to now. From the sounds of it, we could be getting a lot of square boxes as infill.
I'm going to turn that into a question as well, just out of curiosity. Are there aspects of this, Mr. Boel, I'll go to you, if you can pass it to Ms. Elmore if you wish. Are there aspects of this that will encourage the retention of some of these houses as opposed to having them taken down? Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. We did give that some consideration, and there's a bit of 2 trains of thoughts, just in the sense of how many units should be allowed on heritage designated properties. On the one hand, if it's less, then maybe that's an incentive.
Mr. Boel, it's not heritage designated, just in general, to retain housing stock that exists.
I'm sorry. Okay, in general, I don't think the program specifically is geared to that. We have other policies for that in our official community plan, but that's limited to the heritage conservation area, and we do have options in the case of properties for the register to follow a heritage revitalization agreement. But this specific program doesn't include specific incentives for heritage preservation.
Or building preservation. Go ahead, Ms. Wilson.
I'm asking that consideration be given to the character house. I'm not saying necessarily a heritage house. I'm talking about streetscape. And I think it should be one of the considerations in any development permit area or whatever you want to call it. And then the other thing is, I see these new fees that are going to be coming forward. We all know it's incredibly expensive to connect new buildings and things like that. And the ugly word of affordable has not come up. But when you start thinking about adding these extra fees and layering these onto any future development or any densification, I don't get how this would ever work to encourage densification in something like a fourplex or a strata or anything like that. That's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wilson. Please come forward. Same process, just name and municipality residence.
Graham Black, Oak Bay. I've heard lip service paid to the tree canopy, but I haven't actually heard if we've looked into what we expect the impact will be on our tree canopy. Has that been done?
Sure, I'll ask the question of Ms. Elmore. I think that's largely through the lot coverage portion, but welcome back, Ms. Elmore. Perhaps you can answer that question.
Thank you to the chair. Correct. The lot coverage is a large lot coverage and front setbacks are large determinants of tree canopy. The district is working with Diamond Head Consulting that created the urban forest management plan for the district, as well as the tree protection bylaw. And in our next steps as consultants working with the district, we will be working with the arborist at Diamond Head Consulting to continue to protect and enhance the tree canopy through this process. Thank you.
Sorry, so we're going to gain tree canopy, lose tree canopy, or is it neutral?
I'll let Ms. Elmore answer that question as best she can.
Through the chair, or to the chair, no specific study has been done in that regard. However, by maintaining existing site coverage, and by implementing the tree protection bylaw, it is expected that losses to tree canopy will be minimal.
No study's been done though, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Have we looked at the impact this densification is going to have on our groundwater?
Ms. Elmore, I think the answer is going to be pretty similar.
And if it is, just say so.
Ms. Elmore?
Through the chair, I would love to defer to the Director of Engineering.
Sure. So the question is just really impact on, given the suggested lot coverages, impact on drainage, groundwater.
Well, groundwater specifically, because I think that's important for our mature trees.
Sure, groundwater. Mr. Robertson?
There has been no study to date on that.
Do we have the water capacity for an additional 664 units? We're in restrictions right now, are we not?
So, Mr. Robertson, this is referring to the carrying capacity of the water supply system. I think that's the question. Mr. Robertson?
There are no restrictions at this point on water use. There will be, I guess, the seasonal ones that come into place. But as far as the regional district goes in water supply, we have not had an indication that there are any capacity concerns within our system. As I said earlier, those will be studied on a case-by-case basis if there's places where we need to do upsizing.
I guess the one concern that I've got is I don't know any other way to put it, but it's being rammed down our throats rather quickly without proper time to assess what the full impact of densification is going to be. And I think maybe we need to do a little pushback and say we need time to look at certain key issues as to whether or not this is a smart thing to do.
I think everybody appreciates being able to support and not support, but I also want to just make sure that we make everybody who has all the opinions are very comfortable here. So sometimes it's nice to be, I know you're being supportive, but I also think it's helpful if we just make sure everybody has equal chance to be not booed or cheered too much.
The last comment I have is there any study, like I've been trying to follow this through the news, and they're talking about increasing housing, and the object here is very laudable to get affordable housing. Certainly has changed an awful lot in the last decade, but has there been any indication that this is going to make any dent on affordable housing?
I think I can answer that question, which is that this is not intended, even the province acknowledges this will not provide affordable housing, not in the short term. The housing that's provided, that is built, may eventually become more affordable as more units are built. But that's even the provincial recognizes this particular process is not addressing affordable housing.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I will make a point that I think your point, the point of the speaker, please come forward, is well made. Oh no, sorry, the next speaker. You know, I think part of the discussion that we have to have at this table is we're making recommendations forward. Is some of those, how much of those changes are we going to try and implement now, and how much might we, consider to be, a bit of a wait and see approach. We do have some gray area here, but obviously we are required to move the entirety of the project forward before the end of June. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. John Thompson from Oak Bay. There's a large body of research and literature to the effect that the greenest building is the existing building. And that was a featured topic, for example, at the most recent National Conference of the National Trust for Canada. So I'd like to add my voice to the first speaker that consideration should be given to incentivizing retaining existing buildings of all types, really, in order to help address the climate crisis and other environmental concerns. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. I'm going to just go to Ms. Elmore and ask the question of our consultant. Is there anything within this structure that's been looked at that we could consider that would help incent retention of existing houses and perhaps the addition of either additions to those houses to add units and or accelerated dwelling units?
To the chair, thank you for that question. It is an important question to consider. We believe that through the recommendations, the housing form and type is quite flexible and would enable the retention of existing buildings, as well as in many cases the addition of additional dwelling units or secondary suites or stratification of existing buildings. We do know that land values and home values in Oak Bay are very high, and that redevelopment comes at a high cost. And in many cases, it is likely to be found that purchase, demolition, and reconstruction of new units does not make economic sense. Thank you.
Next speaker to come forward, please.
My name is John Armitage. I live in South Oak Bay. I'm an architect, so I take a globalized view of things and also a nerdy, highly detailed view. So the overarching view that I think is important is the fact that Oak Bay is not much more than 100 years old. And this change here is going to radically transform this community for the next 100 years and beyond. Radically. And connected to that, something that I think most Oak Bayers agree upon are the founding principles in our OCP, which is a balance between built form or built heritage, not heritage as in ancient, but just the built form and our natural heritage. And if some of these new changes were to pass and then be automatically enshrined in the OCP, that update that has to follow, it'll have the effect of built form bullying everything else. It'll bully the change in the OCP because all the emphasis has gone on to built form. And what I mean by that is our perception of Oak Bay is essentially a cottage community. Some very large cottages, but nonetheless, our streetscape, our townscape is formed of individual buildings with space around them, which is green space. In contrast, what it is not, our streets are not walls, as we all know and understand well in Europe or suburban Calgary. They're not that, but that's what they're in danger of becoming. The only affordable way, the only economical way to achieve some of these goals on most properties will be demolition. And because, in spite of claims that our coverage ratios are not changing, the problem is most of our lots are underbuilt and they do not currently come up to the coverage. And every time a new house is built, even if it's a small one, trees are lost. Major trees are lost because of root zones, etc. So there will be dramatic changes. And to now get into two little details. Front yard parking, paved areas. I know the diagrams in what was presented in the last two open houses are meant to be just diagrammatic, but nonetheless, we have to take them literally. And when 3 parking spaces are shown in a front yard, each of which is individually accessible from the street, that means something like 30 feet of frontage is now paved, and so is the boulevard. So what happens to all the trees? So that's a major, major concern, that aspect of all of this. Another major concern, I'd like to pick up on what you were saying, Mr. Mayor, about setbacks and massing. I think raising the roof height is fine as a roof peak, but not when it's a square, even with a pitched roof on it. Then you get the individual building is bullying its neighbours. And in particular, what we have currently is an awkward but effective setback of 3 metres for the second floor. That effectively means that, by all means, mass out the bottom, the ground floor, but step back as you go up. There are other ways to achieve that, but that's the one we currently have and understand. And otherwise, you start to get some of the forms that were shown in the study models, where you literally have these big bulky buildings, and you'll have slots of space in between. Just imagine that starting to proliferate. That will not be the Oak Bay that we know, not the Oak Bay we all signed up for and agreed to in the OCP. Last word on heritage. Absolutely echo the previous comments. There's a major impediment in the building code about creating suites within existing homes. In Oak Bay, many of those are heritage potential, but they're character homes. We only have, 180 heritage? It's a very low number. But there's a large number of homes where a lot of that character is in things like ceilings. The building code has this sound transmission class obstacle to creating an upper level suite. We can deal with the life safety issues with drywall and smoke detectors. So Oak Bay, as the authority having jurisdiction, needs to start exercising some discretion over certain issues like that. That's the implementation phase. So I said enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Armitage. And so I'm going to I'll go to this speaker, then I'm going to go to, there's a speaker online who has their hand raised, then I'll come back into the room after this.
Hi, my name's Laura Rouzier. I live in Oak Bay, on St. David Street, actually, right next to one of the houses designated as a heritage home earlier on, which comes with issues, a number of them, none of which have been addressed today, so something to think about for the future. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and councillors, for having this session. It gives us an opportunity to understand what your plans are, what some of the constraints are, and so on. So I very much appreciate that. But I do have some questions and I have some concerns. I'd like to say first, I'm not against densification, but I am for densification that makes sense, that is planned out in advance, thoughtfully, and does not change the fundamental character of a community. That is not something I see at the moment with what is planned. The first question or concern I have is, why are we doing this? Where is the need coming from? The province dictates it. On what basis did we get the number 665? In 2020, Mr. Mayor, you issued a report saying Oak Bay is short 647 houses. That wasn't the province. That was you and the council. It's important we understand that. It's not clear to me what planning was done since that time to address the need or to address the potential zoning changes that would have been sustainable and in keeping with the character of the community. The census of 2015, had more residents in Oak Bay than the census of 2021, the Canada Census. We lost a few hundred people. That means we had more homes. So I again questioned the number of the shortage of homes, 647 in 2020, 665 in 2023 by the province. They simply added 17 homes, 17 residents, to your units to your number, Mr. Mayor. I also don't see that we don't have a problem. I don't see we have a problem integrating immigration. The population of uplands is 10.2%, almost actually higher than that, visible minority, 3.2% of that from China. Another third approximately from India, West Asia, and other countries. So we are a community that is not stagnant, we are not dying, we are renewing ourselves, and we are finding ways to do that. Regardless, I think we should continue to renew, and we can grow, but responsibly. And that takes me to my second concern. And my second concern has to do with the idea that simply changing the zoning throughout the neighborhood, I believe that's what we're talking about, uplands included, am I correct? Simply changing that zoning is the only solution. It's not clear to me that we've looked at other more targeted solutions with long-term planning. Yet we've known this for 4 years, and we have only 4 years to reach the target of 664. I am disappointed that that is the way that we have decided to proceed. I think that will fundamentally change the character of Oak Bay. And those of us who have chosen to live here may not very much appreciate that. My last has to do with the suggestions that I have here. It's not clear to me that we in Oak Bay have looked at lots that have sat dormant for decades. Large building lots on main streets. I will give an example. A lot that is located at 2775 Beach Avenue. Almost an acre in size. On a street that only a block away has multiple residential dwellings on it that can accommodate many. Instead, we are choosing to crowd out communities. And we know where those communities are going to be crowded out, not the uplands, where the price of lots is expensive. Perhaps not so much in South Oak Bay, but North Oak Bay, where the lots may be somewhat cheaper in some areas. Will have an inordinate impact on that particular community. I ask again, have we considered other ways to densify in this community?
I can try and answer some of those questions for you if you wish.
If you allow me, I will just finish and I will sit down. I mentioned the empty building lots. Have we looked at revised approaches? It is a question I would like to see answered. Have we looked at revised approaches? Mr. Mayor, you have said just in the last week publicly, you're not certain we could easily reach these numbers. We could actually do these. If that's the case, we will not be compliant with the province or the federal government, which has also threatened to withhold money, infrastructure money. Is it not the time now to take leadership and say, we can't do this for the following reasons, but we can do that within this period of time and reach a different agreement? Because I do believe you, we will not build 655 units in this town in 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Rouzier. I got that name right. So I'll try and just answer very, very quickly. Please come forward and you can just write your name down at the same time. You're correct. Both the 647 number and the 664 number, for those interested, both came out of a requirement from the province to undertake a housing needs report. We were fairly early out of the gate, but it's a prescribed model that the province uses for those, so there's consistency across the province. So I think because the province was using a very similar process as prescribed by them, their number largely aligned with the number that we had. So that's where that number comes from. The census drop, I will say, is an interesting one. A significant portion, if not all of it, came when the Oak Bay Lodge closed, because quite a few people living there had their primary residence at Oak Bay Lodge, and when they moved out, that had an impact on our things. And the last primary question are why not more targeted? There aren't a lot of empty lots, but there are a couple around. I guess a couple of things. One, the municipalities are not builders. We enable, so what we're talking about here is zoning and providing tools to find directed building. That's our role. So we can't go to someone's private property and build on it, but we can provide the tools and the structure to ensure that that is possible. Unfortunately, the process that's been sort of talked about could we not have a more directed and focused approach, was the approach that we had undertaken, and the one that had a lot of community support, which is our infill housing program that we started. And that program, unfortunately, we really had to put on hold because the province announced that they were going to roll out their own zoning requirements for us, and it seemed not a wise process to spend a lot of money and time coming up with our own plan if the province was going to supersede us. And that's where we are right now, is essentially the province has stepped in and said, you must set aside your own rules and implement these. So that's, unfortunately, it is carte blanche. It's not just Oak Bay. Every municipality in British Columbia now has exactly the same requirements for the primary zoning, and we're trying to work around the edges of that to see what we can do to kind of maintain what we want to keep in Oak Bay. It's an awkward situation, no argument. Please come forward. Oh, sorry, I was going to go online next. The person online is Ms., I have a last name, D-I-J-A-K. If you're there, yeah, there we go, just unmuted, just state your name for the record and municipality resident, and please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Patricia Diak, an Oak Bay resident. And I wanted to say thanks to Andre Boel, Brian Green, and Modis for defining reasonable setback requirements for infill housing, going beyond the minimums required by the BC government to allow room for large trees and green infrastructure that are critical for climate adaptation strategies and our clean air and water. I'd also like to ask 2 questions related to supporting climate adaptation plans based on recommendations from the Natural Assets Initiative and the Stewardship Centre for BC. My first question is about above-ground parking spaces. Can Oak Bay require permeable surfaces such as grass pavers, which absorb excess floodwaters to reduce demand on Oak Bay's aging stormwater infrastructure and also filter pollutants out of our Bucker Creek watershed? And my second question is Oak Bay planning to follow the lead of 27 other BC municipalities and create a natural assets inventory, which can be used to make decisions about new building placements and tree protection and amenity cost charges? For example, the new public safety building at Firefighters Park could be positioned to minimize the effects on the Bucker Creek floodplain. And also large tree roots could be mapped at the start of a development project and used to determine the placement of new infill housing to maintain old growth trees. And this also relates to amenity cost charges where natural assets can be considered public amenities. And Oak Bay could use these charges to support ecologically sensitive areas such as Uplands Park and Cattle Point, and add new rain gardens and wildlife corridors with native plants. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dijak. I'll turn to, I'm sure who I should turn that to, Mr. Boel. Oh, Mr. Green, in terms of the permeable surface possibility.
Through the chair, yeah, so our zoning bylaw currently defines paved surface as an area of land serviced by asphalt, macadam, concrete, interlocking bricks, paving stones, gravel, or other similar materials, so it doesn't differentiate between impermeable surface and permeable surfaces. You know, council has received development variance permits in the past whereby somebody is seeking to increase the paving regulation beyond that 25%, and part of their rationale for as part of their applications is where they are showing permeable paving, and yeah, council has supported those types of variance applications. So that would generate the same. We don't have any plans at this point in time to review that definition to differentiate between permeable paving and impermeable paving, but that could be something that would be, you know, could be considered through that development permit process or through a subsequent change to that definition in the zoning bylaw.
Thank you, Mr. Green. The other question was just related to having a natural asset inventory. Obviously, our amenity cost charges, as a tool for using that, but perhaps you could just share with us. I don't believe we have a concluded natural asset inventory at this point, and certainly we couldn't use those ACCs for park maintenance. It's really for park acquisition, I think, is one of the limits that we have for those tools. But Mr. Boel?
Yeah, thank you. That's correct. We don't have an inventory for that, so right now we haven't not been planning for that just yet. There are some options, as the speaker was referring to, down the road, if we were including that in as part. For example, stormwater is the typical, probably the best example. If there were natural systems that could be included in our stormwater planning, through that avenue, they could be covered by development cost charges, likely. But yeah, at this point, we haven't done that planning for it just yet. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Grant Brolmeyer. I'm a resident of South Oak Bay. First, I just want to say that thank you very much for the open houses on the 1st and the 4th. I attended them, and in particular, I enjoyed speaking with members of council and staff for that, so thank you for that. Laws are like sausages. It's better not to see them being made. It's an old quote there. I understand that the draft zoning bylaws will be presented on June the 3rd. That leaves very little time, and I would like to recommend that the district remove its requirement for owner occupancy for secondary suites. It's found in section 4.2.13.3 of the zoning bylaws. To be clear, this is distinct from the provincial restriction on short-term rental accommodations to suites within principal residences. That provincial legislation is intended to return short-term rental units to the long-term rental market, whereas the Oak Bay owner occupancy bylaw restricts the ability to offer tenancies. I submit that eliminating the owner occupancy requirement in the Oak Bay bylaws will do three things. One, it will remove the current discrimination in Oak Bay against tenancies. Two, it will align with the guidance to Oak Bay from the province. And three, it will remove a deterrent to development of net new housing units in Oak Bay. To point number one, zoning is about uses of land in Oak Bay, not who gets to use land in Oak Bay. Discrimination is wrong based upon characteristics that include but are not limited to race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or disability. And just because discrimination against tenancies is popular in Oak Bay doesn't make it right. And it may not be supportable legally. It's important that we focus on solutions for the issues that we're facing, not the type of people that we might believe cause the issues. To my second point, the province wants Oak Bay to remove its owner occupancy requirements. The legitimacy of our democracy in British Columbia starts with a provincial election and then cascades down to the local governments, not the other way around. Accordingly, the province has empowered Oak Bay to make appropriate local bylaws, address issues such as property maintenance, noise, or other nuisances. To my third point, owner occupancy is a real impediment to development of net new units in Oak Bay. As a built-out community, secondary suites and accessory dwelling units present a viable opportunity for Oak Bay to meet its housing needs. However, the owner occupancy requirement is a significant reduction in property rights and will deter the development of what is low-hanging fruit for additional housing units in Oak Bay. You only need to agree with one of my points. You can disagree with the others. Pick one, pick two, pick all three. They are, one, discrimination is wrong. 2, the province wants you to do it. 3, it's a barrier to additional housing units. So please consider removing the owner occupancy bylaws in Oak Bay. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and for your attention tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Ulmer.
Okay.
Thank you. Please come forward. And don't forget your glasses.
Good evening, it's Susan Roundtree. I live in Oak Bay. They're not all related, they're quite different points. If we put in these 4-to-1s on a single lot, regardless of how it's constructed.
You don't have to be too close to the microphone.
Okay.
You can stand back.
Regardless of the footprint. In the past, when they put a huge development behind our property and all around the fire hall and the former estates, each one of those, if they weren't gated, was at least a strata. I want to know, and now we have single lots 4-to-1, does that to me incentivizes the developers to come in and bulldoze the single family home and put a 4-to-1 in because the lot is about $1 million for 4 units. That's a good deal. So, will each one of those single lots with 4 units on it be a strata? And what's that going to do? This is a top-down action right now across the country. If I refuse to comply, and we've been there 102 years, my grandparents developed it. If I refuse to comply, are they going to jack my taxes again just because I refuse to comply? And if I do choose to do what I want to do, I'm going to develop to the hilt just to get even. Why not? I'm not going to let the developer get it. I'm going to get it. The family earned it. They built that from scratch. The majority of those on that map I saw on the weekend, the majority of the ones they targeted are in North Oak Bay. And we're going to put more in there than the uplands on an acre lot. And Gordon Head up at UVic, which is a subdivision style homes from the 60s, nothing there. Nothing on the Lansdowne slope. Nothing in South Oak Bay. Who's choosing the target? And what are they looking for? I got a lot of questions before I make my decisions. Another problem, water table. I was in civil engineering with the federal government. I've also worked in salmon enhancement, and I live on Belker Creek right on the shore of it. About 2 years ago, they were doing all different kinds of changes around us. You dig a deeper basement under the new regulations to put a basement suite in. Fine, I could have done that. Or you just redo the high school and you change the water flow of the whole region for the playing fields. Fine, I understand that. But from the bank to the next house, to my house, to the house up where the senior center was to be, we were flooded out. Why? Because Oak Bay down in South and North Oak Bay is on a very extremely low water table. My neighbors, when they either put a new basement, deeper basement suite, or they built a brand new house, they got 2 massive pumps running 24 hours a day. God help them if the power goes out, because the water table has been punctured. They went through the clay level and had to go down deeper because we made a mistake in our code when we allowed the basement suites. We didn't think of the water table. Not up on top maybe, but down North Oak Bay, South Oak Bay. There's a big problem for future development. You're telling me we're going to put a lot of new houses in here? What the hell is going to happen to the basements in this region? And the sewer system, it's all engaged. There's massive things here that haven't been thought about. Maybe it's just pertaining to this lay of the land where we are. It may not pertain to other communities, but it sure as hell pertains to this community. And I don't hear a word on any of the practical applications on this and the problem solving. They're just saying, do it by 90 days or what are we going to do to you next? So that the basic ones I've already had to put $45,000 into an overnight new drain system on the basement 2 years ago because of that overnight flooding. It came through under the ground, the ground pressure from up the hill, from other things being disturbed around me, above me, and around me in the flow as they're changing everything. There's a lot of complications here that we haven't even thought about, as well as the tree efforts. I was involved in all of that. I helped with that 10 years ago. I helped with the last OCP. I am for these pocket communities. I think they're a wonderful idea. However, there's another problem, and I never hear this. What's the minimum size for a house? I don't need a 30,000 square foot house. I've lived in 1,000 feet, I have had 2,400, I have had condos, all kinds of different sizes. Affordable can be down 600, like the backyard basements. It could be 800, it could be 1,000. So you have a pocket community like a strata, but a smaller scale. With the four per lot, you can get a pocket community out of that. I've seen them. They're very nicely done. So there's so many things that have not even been considered in any of this. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. I don't care what their rationale is or their excuse for doing it. You don't do it overnight. There's too many things that could come out of this that could go wrong. As well as right. I'm all keen for some of the ideas, but we got to do our homework first. Big homework. With people that can advise us, that have seen stuff going on like that. And we're still struggling to get up to date on our sewage system. That's a huge project. Many breaks, expensive. We're just getting our finances in order. We were the laughingstock of Canada in the real estate magazines a few years ago because we had the worst financials in Canada in the real estate magazine. We're getting on top of that now. You know, there's a lot of things we got to look at. We cannot do what say EB wants before the next election. It's just not practical. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there was a couple of questions in there as well. I think that there was a comment, I'm not sure I quite caught it, but just for clarity, within this, there's no area of target. There's no one zone that we have to apply this evenly by law to all of the RS for any single family or duplex zoning. There is no minimum size of a house. There isn't currently. There used to be when people were concerned about that sort of thing. We don't have it on our books anymore. And there's no requirement under the proposed pieces for stratification if there's multiple units. It could be rental, it could be strata, but there's nothing specific in our bylaws that say which those would have to be. So just, if those were questions, I just want to make sure I answered those portions of it. And I just might also turn to staff on this other question, which is I don't think there's any changes to the underground. A single family house is allowed to go down and build a basement suite below ground, and those changes aren't changing under the proposed pieces for multifamily. Mr. Boel, is that correct? Sorry, there was a comment made about the impact of digging down for these buildings. So is there any changes contemplated right now for the underground portion, the depth or the coverage or any other aspect?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, for repeating that. Not at this point. However, through the infrastructure capacity analysis, that is one of the topics we are interested in relation to stormwater. So, but for today's changes, that is not addressed just yet. Thanks.
Thank you. Actually, before you go, I'm going to ask one other question, follow up on that. Currently, the exemption for basement is limited to, it has to stay within the structure of the house itself. It can't go out and underground, you don't get exempt that. It also maximizes the exemption for underground at 25% of the lot coverage. Is that being contemplated for changing if they're changing the total lot coverage? Mr. Boel?
Not at this point. However, when we are drafting the bylaw text this month, we will look at those kind of related provisions to see if there's the need to make sure that they change along with the proposed changes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, go ahead, please. Name and municipality.
Thank you. So my name's Susan Mitchell. I'm North Oak Bay, and I'll follow behind the other Susan's footsteps. Just in terms of my background, I am a retired businesswoman, so I'm looking at this from an MBA perspective. As a past director of operations in a healthcare company, some things that come to mind as a resident of Oak Bay, where I've had my 3 generations live in, and I would like to be able to pass down that legacy where it does continue to remain an Oak Bay community and not a high-density community. I firmly agree with the infill housing, a requirement that's needed, but it needs to be planned, as other speakers have spoken today in our community, and not knee-jerk. It seems to me as though the majority of these changes that are being proposed are really going to benefit a developer. That developer is going to come in with a 24, 64, 84 unit development, which is either going to take away the smaller housing that we have, or the more affordable housing that younger families, such as my 38-year-old or 36-year-old or 34-year-old, could actually manage to purchase. Now these developers are going to build something bigger and newer and fancier that's going to come with a higher price tag. I don't think that's affordable housing. If they're building something that makes sense and well-planned, then our engineering department, forget who's who here, our utilities, our sidewalks that are required in the majority of places. I'm 61. You know, at some point, I may need a wheelchair, I may need a walker. And sidewalks are imperative. You can't tell me that having one unit and one car is gonna happen. No. And don't tell me that working, doing a potential infill in Carnarvon Park and taking away our green space requirements for a healthy, well-balanced, extended family, such as grandparents, grandchildren, which I hope to have one day, pets, animals, neighbors. It's a community gathering place. It's not a place to build additional housing. So your plans are actually going to benefit the developers, because as an independent, if I chose to turn my large house into a duplex, which maybe we will do, we'll apply for a permit, the cost of the utilities, the sidewalks, the pavement, the sewer, the underground, the water, all of that becomes our cost. No one else's. So we're bearing the cost now of single owner occupant housing that you're asking us to extend our homes and offer increased rental, increased capacity and density, which I firmly believe in, but let's do it well planned out. Those are my key points. My big one, though, from a numbers perspective, and I have to throw this out here, which I do need an answer for, is of the 664 units that are required over a 5-year period. Earlier in the slides that you presented, Mr. Boyd or Bond, that they're currently on the docket, in the pipeline, in the funnel. For the next 6 months, there is 7 single-dwelling units and 32 multi-units. Is that correct? For a total of 39 units in the next 6 months.
There's, you put your comments through me and I'll direct them to staff.
Sure, sorry.
It keeps it easier. The numbers are, so we've had this program in place for 7 months. They count occupancy.
Okay.
So these are net new.
Net new.
So 7 net new units have been occupied. So they obviously were started some time ago because you don't build in 6 months.
Right.
And then there's another 32 units. I'm not sure what the breakdown is, if Mr. Boel or other staff might
So
have the
before he
answer to that.
answers, before we answer
What they
that.
are exactly, but go ahead.
Okay. Doing the math, reverse engineering this, if that's the 6 month, what's in the pipeline, then over the previous 4 years, what was built in Oak Bay?
Not much. Almost nothing.
Okay, so almost nothing. So we're looking at, as previous community members have said, coming up with 664 units. It's either going to be one house, one backline, whatever, or a developer coming in and looking at changing the landscape, which, if we need to do that, we need to do that. I mean, you can set goals. Anyone who can set numbers. You know, when I own a house in 4 years, well, you got to save for your mortgage. You want to build 664 units? Well, doing it one by one is going to be hard, or doing it in larger spaces like where Oak Bay Lodge was, losing those you had mentioned earlier, the over 200 residents affected our census. Well, imagine building something that's going to be sustainable for our diverse retiring community in Oak Bay, where people can continue living that have lived here for generations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will say, I think that the points made about the larger potential multifamily sites that could add meaningfully to those numbers is absolutely correct. That is not what we're here to talk about today. Unfortunately, we're here really just focused on the proposed changes that are mandated to us by in the next month or so. So
Yep,
that's
no,
where
I
we're
understand.
at. So, but I do appreciate the thoughts because they certainly all carry together. We have some people online who have indicated they wish to speak as well, so you can come forward. I'm going to go online first and then back to you, but you can write in your name while you're waiting. I have I think it's last name Ubeda. If you wish to unmute yourself, you have. Just introduce yourself and municipality of residence, and please go ahead.
Hi there, and thanks for having this meeting today. My name is Pamela Ubeda. I'm a registered architect, and I live on St. David Street in South Oak Bay. There's a few points I would like to make as a new resident of Oak Bay. I was in Fairfield for 17 years. And as a registered architect, I deal with development every day. I think what I'd like to maybe start with is I'd like the public to know that well, maybe I'll just tell a bit about my story. I'm, you know, a 40-something woman with 2 children and a mother. My father passed away during COVID in a care home. And I think that the idea of inclusivity and diversity in housing is very important for multi-generational support. As a sandwich generation, I have to provide for my children, and I have to take care of my mother, who was married for 50 years. We sold both of our properties and decided to purchase a property in Oak Bay in order to take advantage of what has been there for quite some time, infill in the OCP. There was options for infill in the OCP. And I don't think the public knows this. I don't think the public knows that there has been an opportunity for infill for a very long time under development permits and potentially rezoning. And I guess in my naivety thought that I, as a professional, would be able to navigate those waters and provide some infill housing so that my mother could age in place. We have been working, well, I would say with Oak Bay for the last year or so, trying to get a small garden suite supported and approved, and we have hit nothing but roadblocks. So I know why there's no numbers in the last 8 months of why no building permits or occupancy has been allowed, because I have firsthand experience of it. To further that, I would say that the lack of support when it comes to development starts to create tension amongst neighbors, which we are currently experiencing. Because when we approached Oak Bay to submit an application for a development permit for infill housing, they said they weren't taking applications at that time, which in my naivety, I didn't realize was not actually a thing. You're not actually allowed not to take applications. So they actually stopped us from providing a development permit application to provide housing for my mother, and so she could have access to her grandchildren and help us out as 2 working parents. I was also worried about her health. I didn't actually think she would make it this far if we didn't help to find her housing. And so I guess my question is, why are there roadblocks to garden suites? Why was there roadblocks to infill all this time? And how is that going to change in the future? Or is there just going to continue to be roadblocks because maybe one number doesn't matter?
Thank you for the question. I think the question of infill is why we're here tonight, is to create some policies and provide a framework so that those answers are clear. I don't want to speak to a specific situation of yours on terms of what the application was, but it is certainly true that the OCP does contemplate infill, and one of the reasons that that was a priority for the council, it has been cited at this point, set aside as we're going through now to try and incorporate the provincial regulation. So that's the answer essentially, is that this is the process we're in right now, is to build those criteria as best we can.
Maybe as a second question then, is there any framework in place for grandfathering existing accessory buildings in, such as garages and backyards, which obviously have accessory building setbacks, not 6-foot setbacks, because most lots don't have that kind of space. Will there be a mechanism to allow grandfathering of existing accessory buildings?
Correct me if I'm wrong, staff, but I believe what was suggested, the answer to the question earlier was that if there's a laneway, it was down to about 1.5 meters, and if it was, I think, 6, a bit more than that, if there was no laneway in terms of setbacks in the backyard. So that's the answer we have right now, and those are some of the questions that we're contemplating.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go in the room here, and then I'll go back online. Welcome.
My name is Barbara Preston.
Can I just get you to push? I just stand, there we go. A bit more directly in front of that. Thank you.
Okay. My name is Barbara Preston. I live in North Oak Bay. I would say in the last 2 weeks, I have become very interested in housing in Oak Bay. Why? Because a couple of weeks ago, by chance, I stumbled on a District of Oak Bay proposal to put a 24-unit rental housing building in Carnarvon Park. an idea that came right out of the blue, not from the consultations 2 or 3 years ago on how the park should be, quote, refreshed. Now I'm listening to everything people are saying about housing with both ears. Sadly, I am no longer sure that you're looking at what's good for this community as a council. I see the district has promised the province it will have 664 new occupied housing units in Oak Bay, from studio apartments to 3 bedrooms within 4.5 years, in other words, by 2028. I see that the largest area of Oak Bay, Uplands, was made a National Historic Site during COVID. I wonder what implications that will have on development there. I also see that Uplands represents a third of all the land in Oak Bay. And if that isn't developable, that will have big implications for the area where I live. I see the province has decided to absolutely get rid of single-family and duplex residential lots in every BC municipality. What a change. And that you, my council, has not voiced a word of concern. I see that Little Oak Bay is being called a naughty boy by the province because we haven't created more housing, so that we're one of the first 10 municipalities to get our targets for new housing. Wow. Oak Bay has to date been a place that people can move to, older people anyway. And if they're willing to pay extra to do it, and it's because of the fine planning that has been done here. Well, I think that's over. As of June 30th, development and growth will be holus bolus. Wherever a property owner or a developer wants to increase density, it will happen. You will have nothing to say on it. Any homeowner will now be able to have 3 or 4 housing units or more, depending on the size of the property. Some of the parking will be on the property, the rest will be on street parking. Setbacks will be reduced, and there will be no neighbor consultation any longer. Some of these units will be low rent. I think, I didn't look at the percentage, but I think it might be 25%. You would know better than me. I suppose that in the future, every developer will have to include low rent units. How can you do it otherwise? And Oak Bay will decide how many and how low the rent. A secondary suite will be allowed on every property. In the past, there have been rules that have made most secondary suites illegal. Will they be legal now or not? Will they have to be fire safe? Will they have egress rules? Council hasn't said. In summary, I see that the council has decided single-handedly that Oak Bay is going to change hugely by 2028. It is making huge decisions on behalf of Oak Bay taxpayers like me without even telling us, much less consulting us. I'm good with increasing density, but like others have said before me, it has to be planned density, not holus bolus. I do not support the end of planning for this community, and I do not support a district government that doesn't tell taxpayers what they're doing in our names. So, my questions. Are you considering other development on city properties like Carnarvon Park? Number 2.
I can answer the first one.
It's okay. I'll give them all, and then you can give. Is there any chance, or is there anything that you can do to resist this huge decision by the province to require zoning changes throughout? Number 3, is this what I am here for now? Is this a consultation, or are you just telling me what's going to happen? I think it's the second. And I suppose number 4, you get asked questions and you keep referring them to staff. I would expect you to know more and be able to answer them yourselves. So, thank you. Thank you for hearing me out. I appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Ms. Preston. I'm going to go online next, but I will
I'm
answer
gonna
your
go sit down.
questions. The next person can come forward and sign in, but to answer the questions, I do tend to defer to staff just to make sure that the staff, the people who have the technical piece of it, responsibility, will give the technical answers. I'm not sure that was actually a question, more than a comment. The question was specifically around, are we contemplating other development, specifically Carnarvon? Very briefly, because we're not here to talk about the Carnarvon, that's a very separate piece. When that came back for consideration, we asked the question because of the questions from the province. Is it possible that housing could be contemplated on that? So as people who have participated in that process, that was sort of one of 4 options. We get a sense of siting and scaling and how that might work without taking away green space. We've had a lot of feedback on that process, but that's not what we're here today about. The question of whether we can resist, I would say the answer is no. At the end of the day, we are creatures of the province. We only have the powers that the province delegates to us, and at any time they can override. In fact, even legal principles such as bylaws having to comply with OCP have been changed over in this space. And I think I'd also just like to comment on the consultation. We are doing our best to include consultation in this process. We are prohibited from having public hearings on these changes. The province has not allowed us to do that. We are running these sessions, both the open houses and this session with the public invited, to inform us. We walk a fine line here that we're not allowed to have a public hearing on these pieces. So it is part of the provincial legislation that affects how we are able to contemplate these changes. So. So the other question, I'll just take it more generally, because we are really here talking about infill. This is a mandated piece from the province. There are potential other places that we could find housing units. UVic is one of them. We're looking at other pieces. Again, we don't control the building, so we are at the behest of other jurisdictions. The 664 unit number, I think, again, is the target that the province has set. There isn't a legal obligation. We don't build anything, so we can't be held sort of directly accountable for those numbers, but we are being held accountable. Are we creating a framework that allows for development to happen? And so that's, if you in the opening presentation, that's the fine line we're walking. We're trying to make sure we enable some of this, but we want to make sure that we're doing what we can within those requirements to keep the character of the community intact at the same time. I'm going to go online here to Mr. Lintern, I think was next, and then I'll go in here and then back to Ms. Edwards.
Hi there. Yeah, you partially answered that question by saying you're not talking about Carnarvon Park. My name is Gwyn Lintern. I'm from Oak Bay. But the question was more, are you considering building on other parks? Lafayette, Windsor, Uplands. Is that what did that come from the advice of the province, or was that an Oak Bay decision to sneak that into the possibilities for Carnarvon Park to build permanent rental housing on top of the recreational space? And I'm asking, as a person who's lived around the world in some of the densest cities in the world, including Hanoi and London, I think density, diversity make for a very exciting place to live, but removing green space is a big mistake. Removing recreation areas is a huge mistake, and I can't really even imagine how that became an option. And I'd like to know if that is seriously being considered by this group for other parks in Oak Bay as well.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Lintern. I'll do my best to answer that question because it's essentially, I guess the short answer is no. We just asked, given the province has made a specific request, if we can share a list of public spaces, public land available for development, and Oak Bay does not have much. So when this was being contemplated, we asked the question, like, if we could build housing, what would it look like on the property? We certainly heard from a lot of people that that's not the desired output, but we'll, that feedback will come back. I would certainly encourage, because this is not the topic for today and we have limited time. No, we're not.
Yeah.
So yes, thank you. The question was why not? The short answer is we are talking specifically about the changes to infill housing tonight. And that's all. If you want to come forward, you can come in the lineup. But tonight we're here talking about the infill housing piece. The other opportunities, multifamily, other types of pieces, we're not contemplating really until we need to get the time required pieces from legislation from the province. Sort of all hands on deck right now to resolve the infill housing piece at this time.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, if it's still my time, my hope is that while we increase our density, we do not decrease the amount of kind of recreational spaces and green spaces and shared community spaces and that sort of thing. So that's my hope.
I think we've actually heard a lot from people on that one, but I also did appreciate the efforts that was given from the consultants to look at if we already have a paved space that, perhaps we could put over top of that. But in terms of the pickleball courts, anyway, I think we've heard
I
loud and
found the
clear from that.
consultants, they're a bit tricky, and they front load the questions so that you get the answers you want, and that's quite apparent, and we're going to be watching out for that in this case of building on our parks. Thanks.
So just for anybody interested in Carnarvon, if you go to connect.oakbay.ca, there's a link there. We are taking all that input on it at this time, so that is going to be going through and coming back. There's 4 options there, but they're not sort of 4 unique options. They're just ideas, and we invite sort of comprehensive comments back on those pieces as well. Back to the infill piece, I'm going to go in here, and then back to the next person online. Welcome, sir.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Don Reed. I live here in Oak Bay. Thanks for the opportunity to ask a question or two and a bit of comment. I was struck by the numbers that you're putting with respect to each lot, different size lots. 3,000 square feet, you're allowing 3 residences, is my understanding. And just barely over 3,000, you can suddenly jump to 4. However, if you have an acre of land, 43,000 square feet, which is, 20 times what these other lots are, the maximum is 4. Now, why in the world would we ever put a maximum of 4 on a 1 acre lot? There's places in Victoria, there's townhouses built on lots where there's 14 units in perhaps an acre, maybe even less than an acre. But here, what we're talking about is putting 3 residential units on one very small lot, 3,000 square feet, very, very small. They're like cheek by jowl, sardines in a can, really. And then you go 1 more unit if you're just over 3,000 square feet. I mean, this is ridiculous, I think. Why, when we've got 1 acre lots, and if people wish to sell them and they wish to develop them, why in the world can't they have 14 units on it? Which would be like, 3,000 square feet per unit. But as it is, what I'm seeing is each of those units, 4 units, if it went to the max on a 10,000 or a 43,000 square foot lot, would be essentially have 10,000 square feet of property. Are these going to become subdivided? Can you imagine putting 4 units on an acre and then having separate sewer lines, separate everything through that property? And then those people not saying, I want to subdivide this property. I want to own that property. I want to have a separate lot. Why wouldn't they do that? I would, if I was them, certainly. But in any case, my question has to do with why in the world would you choose to go from a maximum of 4 on a dinky lot to a maximum of 4 on a huge lot? What is the rationale for that? If you've got a huge lot, and as other people have referred to, the Uplands is one place, but there are others in the neighborhood that are 1 acre lots. Why in the world could you not have 10 units on that? What's the problem? I am in favor of some density increases in this neighborhood. I don't mind that at all. Duplexes are fine, even on smaller lots. 4plexes, no. I think that's ridiculous on a 3,000 square foot lot.
I'm going to do my best to answer the question. We are required by provincial law to allow up to 3 units, anything up to 3,000 square feet. We are required by provincial law to allow 4 units on anything larger than that. that is currently zoned as single-family or duplex zoning. So what we're talking about here, and I'll let staff jump in if they want to correct anything I'm saying, but what we're talking about here there's a difference between what you're allowed and what you're allowed by right. So what we're talking about here is what is allowed under the current, what will be allowed without any additional ask is what is sort of what you're allowed by right. So if you own a piece of property, you will be allowed by right, by requirement of provincial law, to have up to 4 units on it. We can't stop that. That's not our job. We have to allow that. We're providing the framework for what that would look like. That's all we can do. So the question, I think, on the larger lots, and there aren't that many of them, is do we make it as of right that you could build more units on that, which again gets into a fair bit of work at this point, or if we're just looking at being compliant with the provincial law, what do we look at those in the meantime to make sure that be compliant with the provincial law without going through the nuances of some of the specifics of these larger lots. But it does not stop people who have larger lots from making the ask and going through a rezoning process to have more.
Okay, I wasn't aware that it was a provincial requirement.
Yes.
However, why is there a maximum of 4 on a 43,000 square foot lot? What is the reason for that?
So at this point, we're working hard to get our bylaws compliant with the provincial requirements. Their requirements are to have 4. So we're being compliant across all of our single-family zoning to allow 4 as a right. So that's the as of right. You asked the question, why not make the as of right 8 or 10 or 20 for the larger lots? Part of that is just the sheer complexity of going through that, looking at the nuances of those specific sites. There aren't a large number of them, so at this point we're just bringing them into alignment with the provincial legislation.
Okay, but if you went through the Uplands gates, suddenly there would be an awful lot more than 1 acre lots, right?
There's a number in the uplands. Yes.
I'm sorry?
There are a number in the uplands, that's correct.
Yes, a great many. And so anyway, that would be an option for, and I know other people have mentioned that as well, that why not consider the uplands? But I guess my question is, when I looked at those numbers, I was blown away by the fact that there are going to be 3 or 4 residents on a dinky lot and 4 residents max on a 1 acre lot. And that 1 acre lot is going to be divided into 4 properties ultimately. That has to happen, I'm sure. That's what's going to happen. We have to recognize that. The only other point I'd make is that because I sat back here, 3 rows back, looking at that screen. Now, if I hadn't been to the Windsor show the other day, I would not have been able to read anything up there. It was terrible.
The font was too small? Okay.
Absolutely terrible. What was shown up there for the people in the audience. You people are sitting here looking at these things, right?
They're hard to see on here too.
We're not. It was impossible to read. You kept talking about FARs and these kinds of things. I've got good eyesight. I couldn't read any of it. It was ridiculous. Anyway, well, thank you for the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go to the person online. If you're waiting, you can sign in. We have Edwardson online. Please go ahead.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
We can. Please go ahead, Mr. Edwardson.
Can you hear me?
We can. We can hear you.
Okay, thanks. I just have a couple of comments and then a handful of questions. Overall, in general, I just want to say that I really appreciate the effort from Council in making this happen and making overall a good faith effort to comply with provincial requirements on small-scale multi-unit housing. There's a housing shortage. I think we all know that by now. We all have to do our part, and I really feel that this is the first time that I've felt that Council has reacted appropriately to the scale of the housing crisis. I think, there's a lot more work that needs to be done, but this is a genuine, meaningful change that you are doing that is going to make housing a lot more attainable for at least some more people. I also really appreciate the effort that you've made to keep things generally simple, including legalizing a variety of configurations on a lot. This is really good. And overall, I just want to add one more comment that fundamentally wealthy communities should be doing their fair share. Right now, we've been doing the bare minimum. As the mayor noted, so far we have not been building any housing. And to some extent, I think the character of Oak Bay really should change. Right now, we're a very kind of exclusionary neighborhood that doesn't really allow for new people or new families to move in. And so I'm really, really supportive of council's efforts to legalize a greater variety of housing that's going to be attainable to more people. Also, if I can just add, I don't think this is actually that radical of a change. Like places like Burnaby are being required by the province to allow 30, 40-story towers. So I think we should all maybe be grateful that we don't have to do that. We just have to allow 4 units per lot. A couple of questions that might be maybe good for staff or council. At a previous meeting, the consultant said that much of upland, so lots larger than an acre, are only being upzoned to a single family home plus secondary suites. Something about the basis that it's future potential. Is this true, or did I misunderstand something?
Thank you. That is the direction from the province, but Ms. Elmore, perhaps you could just recite the language that the province used for larger lots larger than an acre?
Yes, thank you. To the chair, the province considers parcels that are over an acre to have future potential. Thank you.
So does that mean the district has plans at all to legalize greater density? Because right now it seems that we're making uplands do less than the rest of us. Like you won't be able to build a fourplex in uplands if that's correct.
So that's a decision for council to make as we look at these zoning pieces. I think the recommendation here is, Ms. Elmore, correct me if I'm wrong, is to bring them into alignment with the other single-family zones, but just address, the green space development by altering slightly the floor area ratio and lot coverage.
Okay, it's good to confirm. I just really would like to note that, Uplands is a mansion-only district. The properties there are worth $5-6 million. I don't really think it's worth protecting, and I think we should try to put as much density there as possible. I think staff, consultants, and council should work together, maybe not part of this program, but as part of a future program to try to figure out how we can get a lot more density in that area. Because as others have noted, they're huge lots, and it's like a very wealthy area. I think they can handle a lot more housing.
Thank you for your feedback,
I think
Mr.
that's it
Iverson.
for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please welcome.
Short, because I think everybody wants to go home.
Can you say first and last name, just so we have it on record?
Christina Quebec, sorry. I'm curious if the housing at Carnarvon Park is built, does that contribute to the infill housing?
So the housing ask of the province is interesting in that it asks for 664 units. It lays it out by a mix of, it breaks it down into affordable, et cetera, et cetera. It's based on, it's really kind of a regional look at sort of the housing needs that are coming forward, and that's our share of that housing need is how that's sort of essentially broken down. Any housing that gets built is counted towards that number. Okay. Absolutely.
Okay.
But they
so
don't
what was
say
the reason that
specifically
you
as to
said
what's.
it wasn't to be discussed today if we weren't talking about Carnarvon if it goes to the infill? It seems a little, I don't know.
Well, we're not here talking about the housing targets either. Like in fairness, we're just looking at what is going to be allowed to be built and what is currently single-family duplex zones.
Well, I think I can speak for a huge number of people on this side that building housing at the park is a really bad idea, and council should do better than that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback. And I always encourage everybody, because we've had people write about that, please go on and do fill in the survey, because that will be part of the public record and will inform the decision making. So we'll listen to you here too, but that's the key part. I have no other first-time speakers indicating they wish to speak, so I'm going to go back to second-time speakers, and then we'll have to have a motion to extend the meeting, and we'll get on to some of the business at hand here. Please, if you just speak your name again, just for the record. So we have it.
Susan Roundtree. I live in Oak Bay. UVic. It said Saanich in the Saanich newspaper, and about a huge development proposal. I went to that open house last week because I was curious. And what it is they're going to be doing huge amounts of rental housing off campus on the northwest side and north of UVic. And the idea, they want to generate income from all that new housing. So right away I thought, what about Oak Bay's share of the UVic campus? And I was told, and I heard you on the radio at 6:30 in the morning recently, that they were looking at where the dogs are walked on the east side of the campus, which used to be a farm. It's still an orchard, which at one point they were going to put a hospital there and have a medical school at UVic a few years ago. And you were saying that there's a possibility of doing a lot of housing, new housing there without disrupting the rest of us overnight. And that's why I asked, because I wanted to know when we're sharing that responsibility of that campus, we co-own it. What's the potential for units on that land? Is it 640? How big can we go there? Because what they're planning on the north side of the campus is huge.
So to the specific question, we don't know. At this point, honestly, UVic doesn't have the resources to look at a secondary development. And so there's an ask right now. We would need to do consultation with the community. UVic would have to do consultation with the community. And that all takes money and time, and they don't have any. So there's an ask of the province to help fund both internal staff resources for us and for UVic to contemplate that. The number of units is unknown. The lot itself is about 40 acres. The developable portion of that would be somewhat smaller, just because there's riparian areas backing onto Mystic Creek. So we don't know the numbers. And I would say that it's not that there's no, any of the neighbors would still be impacted. There's still aspects there. It would require, consultation and thoughtfulness, but it is the only site of that size in Oak Bay that we could contemplate something a bit more comprehensive in terms of development. And it's an area, I think, that if we're looking to meaningfully move the needle, it's a very logical place to look. It does not stop us from also having to conclude this work, which is the infill housing. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. I don't see anybody else coming forward, but I want to give people a last chance here before we come back to this table and start giving some guidance to staff in terms of what we might look at coming forward in the intermediate term. Is there anybody else who wishes to talk to council before we go? Yeah, please come forward. Welcome. Same process.
We can't hear you.
Can we just have the microphone turned up a bit? Go say it again, please. No, it's okay. I think you're okay where you are.
Pete Becker.
Thank you. Welcome, Mr. Becker.
And my question is, if the target of 640 units isn't met by the time frame, what would be the repercussions of that?
It's a fine question. They haven't said. All they've really said is they're asking us to give semi-annual reports back to the province to see how we're progressing. They've indicated somewhat that they're willing to look at sort of what efforts are we making to make a good faith effort to see housing built. They've sort of hinted that there's carrots and sticks involved in this, but really there's nothing specific at this point. So I think what we're doing right now is good faith effort to do what we can within the parameters given. I have said this before, and I'll say it again. In some ways, I should have set aside the housing targets as somewhat of a moot point at this point. They came up with that program first, gave us a number of 664 units. This, of course, blanket rezoning gives a potential for significantly more than that as of right within the community. So then it comes down to whoever's going to build. I think if you do the rough math, we have a little over 6,000 lots. So, adding 3 to each of those would add 18,000 potential units. It's way outside of the target. So I think our job here is to try and create the framework for the kind of housing we want as much as we can with what the province allows. And then once we've done that, we've essentially met the requirements of the province, and they haven't. We'll just trust that they're going to be reasonable at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Please come forward. You probably learned the process by now, just name and municipality of residence.
Todd Probilski, Oak Bay.
Welcome.
Mr. Mayor and Council, thank you. I just wanted to get on the record, I guess, because it hasn't been mentioned, my concern for traffic and congestion on the roads and the increase that more housing will cause there. And on-road parking. Most of our roads, or a lot of them, are quite small and already very difficult, and it's becoming more and more difficult over time. And even I think, it seems to me, even the increase in Victoria, the city of Victoria, in my impression, seems to be impacting us, even though you say we haven't increased our housing. Boy, the traffic just seems brutal. And on-street parking, very bad. I just wanted to go on record noting my concern about that, and I'm sure council recognizes the concern for congestion and parking issues on the street. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And certainly, traffic management and so forth are factors generally in community planning. That's, again, not part of, we're not allowed to, sort of prioritize certain areas of the municipality. With that, I don't see anybody else coming forward. So looking around, I'm going to conclude the public input portion of the meeting, and thank you to everybody who spoke. You're welcome to stick around and listen to some of the ongoing dialogue. Before I do that, though, I need to have a motion to extend the meeting. So I think we probably to 10 o'clock. Hopefully give enough direction within that time. Well before that, ideally. Moved and seconded. Thank you.
Can we have a bio break?
Yes. All those in favor? Any opposed? Unopposed? We're just going to take a 5.
Sorry, I'm opposed to the 10 o'clock time.
Okay. So we have a.
9:30. Say 9:30.
Can we have would Councillor Green, would you be willing to make a motion to something shorter than that? We do have to give some direction to staff to come back. What would you just going to ask you if you can make a suggestion for what you'd find?
9:30 at the latest.
Okay. So we have a motion to extend the meeting to 9:30. Any discussion on that? We don't really discuss that. All those in favor? Any opposed? Unopposed? So we will get out of here by 9:30. That being said, we just still need to stand up and stretch our legs for 3 minutes. Thank you, everybody who came out, and we will. Oh, it's a really empty room all of a sudden. We'll see you back here at right at 9 o'clock, 9:01. There we go. Just, perfect. Wonderful. Thank you very much. So that gets picked up by the cameras, and thank you to everybody for allowing us to have a quick break here. We do have some limited time here. We only have 25 minutes left, which, breaking it down, is a little less than 4 minutes per councillor to give some initial feedback. We're not going to get to the point of having sort of firm motion. So what I've just talked to staff about is the potential of bringing this back to a special meeting, either adding it to the to the committee of the whole in the month of May, so in a couple of weeks' time, or calling a special meeting, both of which have some challenges, but we can work through that, just given the constraints we have here tonight. There's a lot to take in, a lot of information shared. So what I think I might do is, just in the interest of meeting the timelines, because we do have a hard stop at 9:30, is to go down the line here and just take any sort of feedback from people on where they're landing. The big four, obviously, is the parking, setbacks, heights, and lot coverage. So if there's just some general thoughts that people have about those aspects, because those are the pieces that actually have to be written into the bylaw, more than anything else, and perhaps some philosophical approaches to where people are feeling, obviously we can make, more changes or less changes at the initial piece of it, how much, if there's anything that people be more comfortable leaving to a later date, things that people would really want to see included in the bylaw at its initial change. We do have, obviously, the requirements from the province, but these are sort of all the ancillary pieces. So with that, if members of council are prepared, I'd probably just walk down the line here. Councillor Smart, are you okay with that, just sort of going in that order? You had your hand up?
Oh, I'm fine to go in whatever order you wish, but I'm ready anytime.
Okay. She's ready now, but I'm happy to sort of walk down the line here, just so I can kind of keep people on time. Are you prepared, Councillor Green, to say a few words, or if you don't, I'll go in the order that people prefer.
No, thank you. I can speak. And I apologize for not agreeing to the 10 o'clock timeline, but I'm concerned about staff and my knees. So those in that order. I think I heard some major issues. First of all, about green space, protecting green space, the need for permeable surfaces as opposed to hardscape paving, the need to protect tree canopies, natural habitats, and parkland. I also heard people concerned about the owner occupancy requirement for secondary suites. I think that's one that we really need to address, and we can do that. I recall at the time it was a compromise recommendation, and I think that's an important one that we should pay attention to. I heard a question about what are the repercussions if we don't meet the targets. I think that's something we haven't really talked about a lot as a group, and that would be something I think worth sharing if that's possible. And then I think what people really want to know is what are the impacts on them personally, on their own properties, on their neighbor properties, and what are the impacts of high densification in established neighborhoods. And I think the 4-unit issue on small lots versus 1-acre lots was an issue as well. And then, of course, the uplands and heritage. So those are my big takeaways. And thank you for the chance to share those.
Thank you, Councillor Green. And by all means, anybody, if you have specific aspects of the bylaw that you think you're supportive of or would like to see different, as we have staff recommendations in general here, sort of trying to balance the pieces. So those are, I think, helpful, the more sort of clarity we can provide. Again, not to give direction at this point, but just so we can all hear each other about where we're kind of leaning and where we see the pinch points. Go ahead, Councillor Watson.
Thank you, and I will try to be less than 3 minutes if I can here. Things that caught my attention, and I think if we can address them now would make sense, is certainly incentives, or maybe it's carrots, I don't know if it's carrots or sticks, to retain existing buildings, because the more we retain existing buildings to achieve the infill targets, the more we keep the character of our streetscapes. So the bylaw, as the options as presented, really don't have anything in them right now to do that. So I think that some thought there would be helpful. Also, one gentleman commented on the building code as an impediment to creating livable second-story units in character homes. And I know that there are building code issues that maybe we do have some control over, where we'd have some authority. So I flagged that too. Permeable paving as a way to help protect groundwater recharge, and maybe really we may need to look at our paving requirements outside of our zoning bylaw as part of this as well. But I also do want more generally in the proposals, I'm concerned about even a parking requirement as low as 0.75 if that ends up having 3 spaces in a front yard and then those setbacks. I think that's too much, and that we should be bold to reduce that further and use the space on our streets to store cars if necessary. But we should not be letting parking drive the outcomes, because I think it's just not a solution for the kind of character we want. Each parking space in the front of a home detracts from all the things we're trying to achieve. So 0.75, I think it was an ambitious proposal from the consultants and staff, but I'd like to see it lower than that. Finally, the mayor flagged this, but absent development permits for all of these proposals that come in, any other tools that we might have to actually deal with building bulk. Like the flat roof versus the peaked roof, and how we actually would control that form with the tools that we've got, or whether we really are in effect going to be facing form and character permits for every single one of these redevelopments. So that's something I'm concerned about. That's it for now.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Go ahead, Councillor Appleton.
Thank you, Your Worship. So specific comments on what I've heard here tonight, hopefully for the benefit of staff. First of all, with respect to reducing FAR numbers primarily for the uplands, RS 1, 2, 3 type lots, I asked that question of the consultant, and I can hear the rationale there, and I think that that's a reasonable way to come at it. I take a different view on how that would actually play out. I think that the existing level of FAR does indeed allow for a larger structure. I think, in my opinion, that allows for different housing forms, potentially more denser and different types of housing forms on those types of lots. So I actually feel that if you reduce the FAR, it drives towards larger, more expensive single-family homes, and for folks that don't necessarily need to have an additional unit on those lots. So I would like to see us consider innovative housing forms on the larger lots in uplands, because I think they could be accommodated both parking-wise and streetscape-wise in an easier way than on a smaller lot, as been noted by some of the people who spoke tonight. So I actually don't favor the idea of reducing FAR for uplands lots. Two things for form and character that we discussed tonight that I think are, to my mind, are important to keep in mind. The second floor setback piece that came up in a couple of different contexts, as far as how you try to avoid sort of large looming buildings and buildings that are that appear to be visually encroaching on their neighbors. You know, that second floor setback piece, I think, could use some thought and some further discussion about how we would look at that second floor in terms of avoiding the big box. And similarly to what my colleagues have said, speaking to the front yard paved area is a big topic for me, as far as how to accommodate vehicles and mandatory parking to try to minimize to the maximum extent possible the front yard paved surface and how that gets done. So I think we have to get, in my opinion, pretty creative about how we mandate that and how much parking we actually require. I also concur that less parking is better. And then just finally, with respect to DPAs, I did ask a question about sort of the end point of DPAs, infill DPAs, and I know we need standards and guidelines to roll out the standards necessary to make this actually work. I'm a big proponent of having as much of those standards written into zoning bylaws and being allowed by right as possible. and with an eye to streamlining the process, making life simpler for staff, dealing with less variances at the DPA standard, and trying to streamline that process as much as possible. So somewhere in the middle of no DPA and a comprehensive DPA that covers everything, I would love to be able to find a middle ground that gives us some standardized language to the maximum extent possible. Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. Councillor Braithwaite?
Thank you. Looking at the time, I'll make my comments really, really short because people have said a lot of things that I wanted to say already. So agree with the permeable paving aspect because I'm really concerned about the 50% surface area, hard surface area that has been suggested. I think it was for the RS 4 and 5. And I'm very concerned about that because I don't want to see that happen. I also, as far as the parking goes for RS 4 or 5, etc., I would actually like to see it increased to 1 from the 0.75. I wouldn't like to see it decreased. And as far as maximum FAR in those zones as well, I think that it says it's 0.4 for single dwelling and none for infill. I have a bit of a concern that there's no maximum FAR for infill. So I would like to discuss that a little bit further at another time, I think, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Braithwaite. Go ahead, Councillor Smart.
Thank you. So in the big picture, I guess I'm just looking at the three things that I don't want to look back on and regret. So one of them is having guidelines that encourage the tear down of buildings. Another one is to lose our green space. And then a third one would be to lose opportunities to encourage accessible design. And so then I take that to some value statements. So definitely, like, this is what I've heard overwhelmingly in the community is green space over parking. So this is choosing trees over parking spots. You can't have both. So I want the trees, I want the green space. We can lose the parking. Preserving our existing housing stock is really important, and other municipalities are looking at reducing their rear yard setbacks because they very carefully studied how if we don't give some flexibility in the rear yard setback, then we are going to be encouraging demolition of our housing stock. The third one is obviously we need to be increasing the number of housing units, so we can't not lose track of our ultimate goal here, and encouraging accessible suites, as I mentioned. So we need to have a smooth building permit process. So I would love to see either no DPA process plus FAR, or no FAR and a DP process, but not both. So the specific recommendations I have are when we're looking at the current percentage of lot paved area, to actually flip that and to phrase it as a percentage of green space that we want and show our values in our zoning. The second recommendation would be to either have a transportation demand management chart, which is pretty simple, prescriptive to choose from, which would allow for options to reduce parking, or have a maximum of 2 car spaces per lot, so that we're not choosing cars over trees. The third recommendation is considering a smaller rear yard setback, as I mentioned, to preserve existing housing stock. Fourth recommendation is to ensure accessible secondary suites are possible, and so just to really study that, especially with our basement exemption for floor area and the particular wording around 2 stories as the guidelines are going forward, to really make sure that we're encouraging the possibility of building accessible secondary suites. Additionally, I really think we need to look at increasing our allowable lot coverage to greater for corner lots and laneway roads, where we have the option of having 2 street frontages. I think there's an opportunity there that we shouldn't miss out on. And I agree with the owner-occupied buildings for secondary suites needs to go from an equity point of view. We need more housing. And I think the only other thing is, and then the only other one is the setbacks. So I honestly think we need to lose the second floor setback. I think it's going to be really problematic for design, for looking at 3 to 4 housing options. If you have that second floor setback, it's really going to it's going to be a problem, and everything's going to need to come with variances as far as having flexibility of different housing options. And the same thing with the combined setback. I think those two things need to be looked at more carefully with regards to the different typologies that would be on the site. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Smart. Go ahead, Councillor Patterson.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I think everything has been pretty much covered, so I'm not going to go over it again. The only things that I haven't heard, I guess, and that is
Councillor Patterson, why don't you just state the things that struck
yeah,
you as
in
being
this
worthwhile
in the
as a
smaller
whole?
in the smaller lot zones, I think that we have to have better answers on the utility services, the parking and paving, so that we avoid ghetto sizing those streets, and we have to provide for safe, active transportation on those roadways too, because as the streets are getting more congested, they're getting more dangerous, and residents are already noticing it, and I expect that's going to get worse. So those are the additions. Other than that, I think I agree with most of what's been said at the table, and especially we have to rethink uplands and whether it's changing the FAR or developing a framework for DPAs to allow us to be more flexible in that area. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot to go over, but I'll be quick as I can. So I think that I'm fall firmly on the side of not having DPAs and having FAR. I think the clarity that provides, I appreciated the answer that it's almost impossible to do the suggested approach without having a DPA process, but that really requires a siting and design approval for every build, which just adds an enormous amount in the long run of things that I don't think is sustainable. And frankly, I think I'm always of the mind that you create the framework for what can be built and leave it to the creativity of the people building. It also creates significant issues with using setbacks, because if you have a primary building and then want to put a building at the back, you have to, there's so many things that come into that make it difficult, where, you know, a simpler approach to my mind is the better. I think we can frankly keep a couple of parking spots as a minimum on lots, given that the general shape and size is relatively the same, and we are still requiring that one setback that allows for parking beside the house as well as in front, and between those two, that's not a problem to cover. I think you know, I think as long as there's still an exemption for one indoor parking spot, so people can build it if they want. And again, this makes it easier if there's a floor area ratio, because you can allow for exemptions to be counted towards those. Supportive of the setbacks as recommended here. I actually like the second story setbacks. I appreciate it creates a bit of a design problem at times, but it also really does reflect a rhythm and style to the streetscapes that I think, well, you can have a bigger building, can still fit into the rhythm. I do think that we have to be very clear about what the roof height is, and I think defining it to the halfway point of a slope of a roof, not the peak, is a very valuable piece, because it allows for, again, the sense of scale. You can build a very tall building with a very peaked roof. The peak of the roof doesn't matter. It's the lowest point of that roof and the flat side of the building that matters. So I'm of the mind that, you know, we want to allow for the, you know, a buildable roof height, but I think allowing for a peak roof of a sloped roof makes a lot of sense. The uplands is an interesting question. I'm supportive of the suggestions that the staff has put forward on those. I think that we do need to preserve green space on those, and I think where I'm coming at this from a little bit is things like parking and some of these other pieces. I think we need to get something on the books right now, and so my thinking of this is, let's do all of those changes essentially writ large, and then perhaps come back and look at things like reduced parking requirements in areas that have either a TDM or at least are close to transit or commercial centers, so we can start incentivizing some things for that. And in fact, start looking, once we get through this initial cut, at maybe some more density in those areas as well. But right now we're dealing with the overall big picture pieces. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, realistically, if we want to see the character of the community and housing built, you know, what we heard overwhelmingly in our earlier infill housing was the desire for the ability to build in things like carriage houses, laneway houses, additional dwelling units for families. You know, I think we got to make sure that, again, make this as simple as possible to allow those to happen. In fact, if anything, create incentives, as we talked about, to make sure that we're maintaining the existing housing stock and adding to it, either through extension or through additional dwelling unit on the same site. That's the most attainable and most doable by most homeowners at this point. It's actually something they can do, whereas the tear down and rebuild is going to be really the purview of the development community, and we're already hearing how hard that's going to make work. There we go. Those are my summary of my thoughts. We have 5 minutes left before we have to cut off. Is there anything else that anybody wishes to add? So procedurally here, that's sort of a sharing of thoughts at this table. We're going to have to sort of try and get some of those thoughts consolidated into some options. We're going to have to have a special meeting here to come back and maybe give through motion, some direction to staff to draft up the bylaws. They're going to be in a bit of a hard point right now to draft those bylaws given the uncertainty of what the council is going to come back with. So we're going to try and get that done as soon as possible. But I don't have a date for the public or for council at this point yet. I just, an effort to find a time that will work for everybody. So I think that's essentially where we're at right now. Is there anything else staff want to add at this point before we sign off? We're all good? Wow, we're not going to cut off automatically. I guess I need a motion. Move adjournment. Seconded. All those in favor? Any opposed? None opposed. Thank you to everybody who attended online and in person. We have a much emptier room now than when we started. I hope we were able to provide some valuable information. We'll see you all at a meeting coming soon.